Florence is a city of art and light, of marble facades and frescoes whose colors refuse to fade. Yet beauty has its shadows. Every painting waits for a crack. Every mirror waits for a face. Welcome back to Somnolent Conspiracies, where the treasures of history lean closer than they should, and where silence is never proof of safety. Tonight we walk into an apartment on Via della Pergola, where a mirror older than any tenant hangs heavy against plaster. No dust dulls its frame. No crack mars its silver. The landlady says it came with the building, an heirloom no one dared to move. It was meant to be decoration, an antique curiosity for renters who prized atmosphere. But atmosphere became evidence. A body was found here last week, struck cleanly from behind. No forced entry, no weapon recovered. The door was bolted, the windows locked, and yet the victim's last photograph, snapped by a tourist from across the street at the very moment, shows something uncanny. In the angle of the antique mirror, a figure stands close, too close, the silhouette of a man with a blade poised high. The police swept the room. They found no man, no blade, only the mirror, cold and heavy, reflecting absence. Some said it was a trick of light, the distortion of old glass. Others whispered it was the mirror's own appetite, recording sins that had not yet been admitted. Our detective will trace this image, frame by frame, back through pawn records, restoration notes, and the whispered history of Florence's darker corners. We will follow the reflection until it stops being metaphor and starts being confession. Settle in. Look once into the glass. Look twice. And ask yourself, what if the only witness to a crime is something that never breathes? The call reached Detective Alessandro Valli as a thin-blooded evening folded across Florence, the kind that made the marble seem warmer than the air. He was already near Piazza Santissima Annunziata, finishing a coffee that had gone past useful, when the dispatcher said the words he disliked most. Locked room, no weapon. He took the stairs two at a time to the second-floor flat on Via della Pergola, a place with serious crown molding and a front door that had decided to be stubborn only after something irreversible had happened behind it. Inside, the scene unit moved carefully, the way you move when every step might smudge a truth thin as dust. The apartment had the self-conscious neatness of a rental meant to be photographed. White walls, a blue runner over walnut boards, 3 prints aligned with geometric anxiety. On the far wall hung the only thing that didn't try to be modern, a mirror taller than a man, its frame gilded with age in that believable way time does. No theatrical chips, just soft bruises in the carving where fingers had tested the grain over centuries. It sat above a narrow console and opposed a pair of windows shuttered against the day. At the center of the room, near the rug's edge, lay the body. Renata Moretti, 42, art dealer with a knack for finding things that wanted to be wanted. A blanket already stretched over the worst, but the medical examiner, Caselli, lifted the corner when Valli knelt. The wound was at the base of the skull, angled neat and mean, as if somebody had used the idea of geometry as a weapon. No arterial spray on the walls, just a dark flower that had bloomed under her hair and soaked into the rug. The lack of mess suggested a narrow blade, inserted with precision and withdrawn without ceremony. "What do we have?" Valli asked. He kept his voice low, not out of respect for the dead. Respect for the dead is a habit, not a tone, but out of reverence for what silence can reveal. Caselli pointed a gloved finger. One blow, posterior, likely a stiletto-type blade. 17 centimeters, give or take. Smashed the little bones as if they were waiting to be smashed. Time of death, early afternoon before 3. No defensive wounds. Either she trusted whoever stood behind her, or she never saw it. Valli stood. The room was square, honest. Kitchen nook with a kettle and the sweet chemical of orange peel cleaner. Bedroom door ajar. Bed made in the military manner of someone who cleans to deserve sleep. No drawers spilled. No packing box mid-action. No evidence of struggle. The front door had been bolted from the inside when they arrived. A locksmith had taken 20 minutes to coax it open, while a neighbor wrung his hands in the hall and described hearing nothing. The 2 windows had their latches set. No balcony, no rope, no trick. If there was an exit, it was either earlier, quieter, or impossible. "Detective," said one of the evidence techs, a woman with careful hands. "You'll want to see this." She gestured to the console table beneath the mirror, where someone had laid out a glossy print, still damp in the way that makes paper a little reluctant to lie flat. Valley leaned closer. It was a tourist's photograph shot from the street. The angle was a few degrees off the perpendicular, the way you frame a cafe scene and get curious about a window above it. The photo included her, Renata, turned slightly, her profile crisp in the glass. A vase on the console, the mirror swallowing the room and giving it back. And something else. In the reflection, a man stood behind her. Not a man as in an abstraction of a shape. A man with mass and position and intention. The shadow of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the right arm rising with a blade as slender as a journalist's pen. His face was a smudge, either by motion or mercy. But the posture was unmistakable. The moment before the blow, the composure of a decision finished inside the body. Valley felt his molars clamp. He forced them open. "Who took this?" "American," the tech said. "Backpacker with a camera she treats like a pet. She and her boyfriend were at the cafe across the street about 2 o'clock. She liked the light on the shutters aimed up, and there it is. She came forward when she saw the police vans." He studied the print. Reflections lie all the time. They add and subtract. An old mirror can double a candle, turn one man into 3, lift shadows where there are none. But reflection has its habits. Angles must obey. Distances must whisper what's true. He checked the actual room against the photograph. The console, the vase, the curve of the gold frame. In the glass, the door behind him was a dark rectangle, as faithful as any simple thing. He watched himself look at himself. Nothing else looked back. He asked the tech to get him the card with the original images and walked to the windows. Outside, late afternoon took its time, and the piazza held the measured comfort of a normal day. A bus sighing as it knelt, a handful of school uniforms, a woman with a dog the color of ginger. The American backpacker stood with a uniformed officer by the cafe's silver chairs, hands traveling through excited shapes in the air. Valley marked the angle she must have stood at, the way her lens would have snuck past sun to find a second-story rectangle. He counted bricks and sight lines. The geometry still whispered, true. "Any prints?" he asked, not because he expected any. Cleaners and renters and the merciless grind of life ensure prints are either everywhere or nowhere, but because questions are a ritual that convinces the brain to stop playing enchantment and return to habit. "Belonging to the victim," the tech said. "A few partials that could be anyone. Nothing obvious. Signs of entry?" "The bolt says no," Caselli answered, folding the blanket back over the dead. "If someone came in, they had a key. Or she let them in and then bolted the door alone, which seems unlikely even for the doomed." The landlord, a woman named Lucia Fabri, waited in the hall, her professional smile wedged under a nervous frown. When Valley stepped out, she lifted her chin like a person ready to be blamed for the weather. "I told the young woman when she signed, I told her to be careful. It's a good building, but old things have their moods." "Old things often do," Valley said. "You're the landlady. 6 apartments. This one was available." She had references very respectful. No late nights. No cigarettes. Lucia's eyes went toward the doorframe, where the locksmith's work had left a petal of wood on the floor. "I hated doing that. Anyone else with keys?" "Just me and the cleaner. Cleaner hasn't been this week." Sometimes Miss Moretti cleaned herself. She liked things particular. "You know her work?" She dealt in paintings, sometimes little things. A pair of candlesticks with bees. She had plans for that. Lucia angled her head toward the mirror inside, like a superstitious person nods toward a church without crossing themselves. "She said it was valuable." "How long has the mirror been here?" Lucia's mouth twitched. "Longer than me. Came with the building. The previous owner was the kind who calls things heirlooms once he can't sell them. We never move it. It's heavy." When the wall was replastered, the workers built around it. "Any issues? Accidents? Break-ins? Arguments?" "Not with Miss Moretti. She was the kind people argued with in a polite tone. She got what she wanted by making you think you suggested it. Lucia's fingers smoothed the edge of a rent receipt she had been crushing without noticing. I can make a list of visitors, but it will be short. He let her go and returned to the room. The photographer had given them permission to pull the raw files. Valley set his laptop on the console, aware of the mirror at his back, that primal warning some bones still remember, the sense of being watched by a surface, but he ignored it. He loaded the sequence. The shots were as tourists take them. Adjusted exposure, recomposed, zoomed, shot again to get the line straight. In 3 images, the window caught the interior like a tarot card promising revelation. Renata in profile, head bent toward some paperwork. Then the figure behind her, arm rising. Then only Renata again, half turned, as if something had brushed her attention but not her sense of danger. He zoomed until pixels broke alignment and became a low hum. The knife's outline owed more to intent than to resolution, but the foreshortened blade told the same story as the wound. He drew a line on the screen from the figure's arm to the place where, in the room, he himself now stood. Reflex made him look across his shoulder. Nothing. Could be a composite, the tech suggested. Phones today can do things they shouldn't. It's a DSLR, Valley said. Manual focus. The metadata says so. No in-camera trick, and the woman isn't the sort to make up a ghost to be interesting. She was shaking, not proud. Reflection off another window? The tech offered because good techs try to give the world an excuse to make sense. Somebody inside the cafe, lining up behind her, doubled in the glass and translated upward. Valley studied the layout. Angles again. The cafe awning would break such an echo. The street did not allow that mathematics. No, he said. It's not generous enough to be wrong that way. He walked to the mirror and regarded himself. It gave him back a man in his late 40s with a face that had learned to be ordinary. His hair had conceded to gray at the temples, the only vanity he let run free. He had the stance of someone who grew up in a house where you learned to move quietly so others didn't, and the habit of checking corners had replaced the habit of praying. In the glass, he looked like someone you would forget in a cafe, until he asked the one question that emptied people of their lies. He leaned closer. The silver was too clean for its age. No webbing of mercury damage under the glass. No greenish islands. He lifted a penlight and gauged the reflection's stillness. Good mirrors shiver at their edges when you move the light. This one held steady, as if depth had become stubborn. On the backing, where the frame's inner lip met the wood, he saw faint ticks. Not scratches from clumsy moving, not the careless vandalism of renters, but marks spaced with a craftsman's temper. Initials would be louder than this. These were patient, counting, maybe, someone's lonely arithmetic. Photograph this edge, he said. Macro, UV if we have it, and pull the bolts. I want to know exactly how this sits in the wall. Caselli made a small noise. Don't break your neck getting it down. If it's the building's spine, Lucia will cry, and I've had enough salt today. We won't move it unless we must, Valley replied. But measure everything you can measure. He stood in the center of the rug and reconstructed the interval in his head. Door bolted, windows latched, no weapon. A photograph of a moment that should not have been, taken by someone who did not know to be afraid. A reflection giving away a crime the room refused to host. What makes a locked room is not the absence of exits. It's the presence of certainty. The detective's job is to erode that certainty until a line appears, hair-thin, then widening, through which reality and its most patient liar, human intention, can be seen. He told the team to bag the paperwork on the console and the vase's base for prints. He asked for shoe impressions off the dust line near the skirting board. There were none, of course. Whoever came wore the confidence of someone who had learned to be careful at the level of breath. He requested the neighboring cameras from the traffic department. If nothing else, he wanted to fold time back on itself and see who approached the door when the world pretended to be boring. When he finally stepped out to speak to the American with the camera, the sky had crawled toward evening enough to make the piazza's lamps credible. The woman's fingers were still talking as much as her mouth. I like reflections because they're like second thoughts, she said. And then I zoomed in later and I know how it sounds. I do. He looked like he could see me. Did he? Valley asked. He didn't smile, but he let his voice accept that she might be reporting a feeling instead of a fact. She nodded once, hard, like when a person notices they're being watched. He was in the mirror, and she wasn't looking, and I thought for a second, should I call up? But you don't shout at strangers' windows in Italy. I mean, you probably do, but you came forward when you saw the vans, Valley said. Yeah. Thank you, he said, because people need to be thanked when they bring you the truth even if it arrives badly dressed. Back inside, he told the evidence tech to enlarge the photograph and print it for the board. He asked another to start a background on the mirror. Valuation requests, provenance inquiries, insurance policies, any recent restoration notes in the city's tight little network of studios where old things are made obedient enough to be sold again. On the victim, he wanted the usual. Financials, messages, calendar, disputes. He did not yet write down "knife appeared in reflection," because he preferred to leave the absurd naked until it demanded clothes. When the room had been reduced to tape lines and spool numbers, when Caselli zipped her bag and the locksmith patched the bolt so the door could be closed without apology, Valley lingered. He took the chair near the console and let the mirror sit across from him like a witness who could not be browbeaten, only endured. He watched his own patience reflect back. He watched the door behind him remain a door. He watched himself become smaller as the light withdrew. At some point, the building exhaled old wood easing. In that minute between one sound and the next, he thought he saw, no, he did not think, he felt a shade of motion in the glass behind his shoulder, a density in the air. He turned his head too fast and caught only himself doing it. He stood and clicked off the penlight. "We'll talk again," he said to the room, which is a stupid thing to say unless you mean it. As he left, he paused with his hand on the jamb and looked back once, the way you look at the sea to make sure it still intends to be a sea. The mirror gave him nothing except his own tired outline and the silver calm of something that had learned over centuries how to keep a secret until asked correctly. Down on the street, the city resumed itself. A mop beat a stone step. Someone laughed with their head thrown back. Valley felt the weight of the print in the folder under his arm and the idea of a blade that had given no blood to the walls. He thought of the landlady's phrase, "Old things have their moods," and decided to begin not with the dead, but with the antique that had learned how to be in a room longer than anyone who ever entered it. Enlarge the photograph, he told himself out loud, because orders are a shield, and find me whoever last touched that mirror. He started walking toward headquarters, and the last light took the color out of the sky, and every pane of glass in every window he passed seemed, for a moment, freshly polished. The next morning brought a Protestant light to Catholic stone. Flat, undecorated, good for work. Valley liked mornings that made promises without romance. He signed for the overnight reports at his desk and found what he needed. The initial canvas, a soft list of neighbors who had seen nothing, the download of Renata Moretti's calendar, the first pass on the mirror's provenance, thin as an excuse but not empty. He started with Lucia Fabri again. Landladies, in his experience, kept cities stitched together by remembering who moved where and when, even if they claimed they forgot. Lucia met him in the courtyard behind the building, where a lemon tree did its best version of endurance. She handed him a manila folder as if it were a dog she did not trust him to like. "I looked," she said, "as far back as the papers go. The mirror is in photographs from 1974, when the old owner, Signor Berti, did renovations. You can see it, wrapped in brown paper but still obvious. And here." She flipped to a black and white shot that had been copied poorly, midtones sliding toward the deep end. Workmen in suspenders smoked in a room with a naked wall. At the center, a boulder-shaped package leaned, nearly as tall as the men. At one edge of the wrapping there was a triangle of exposed gold like a cuff showing from a too long sleeve. "Berti told people it was part of the building," Lucia said. "I always thought he liked the theater of saying that. He was a man who loved phrases that made him seem connected to history. But I never saw a receipt or an insurance policy that specified it as his. No invoice. No family photo of a great-aunt using it to check her hemline before a ball. Anyone ever try to move it?" Lucia's laugh was a hesitant cough. The plasterers tried to take it down in 1991, after a crack near the bracket. 2 men and a pulley, they told me. It didn't so much refuse as suggest they stop. The bracket gave them trouble. They said the screws were handmade, set in a way they couldn't map. In the end, they patched around it and swore at old things the way men swear when they feel small. Valley nodded toward the upstairs window. You said Renata planned to sell it. She talked about an appraisal, Lucia said. Said there were buyers who liked objects with stories. Her phrase. She had a list. But the day after she told me, she came down and said perhaps not. She seemed less sure. Do you know which house she contacted? She mentioned Caruso, the one near Santa Croce. Very serious. Clean windows. You know the place. I do, Valley said. He did. Dr. Sofia Caruso had a reputation for telling the wealthy why they were wrong about the past and making them grateful for the lesson. He left Lucia and walked the distance to Caruso's studio instead of driving. Florence is a city where cars feel like a mistranslation. On the way, he let the streets arrange the thoughts. A mirror older than paperwork, older than certainty. Marks on its backing that weren't vandalism. A victim who worked with stories and knew how to place one in a room so it would be bought. A photograph that insisted on a man who wasn't there. Caruso's place had the smell of paper that knew its value. The first room was a clean rectangle with a counter for receiving objects too fragile to be greeted with anything so clumsy as a handshake. A bell made a bright noise when he entered, and after a moment Sophia appeared, wiping her hands as if words left residue. She was small, late 50s, neat as a ledger, with hair the color of iron and eyes like accuracy. Detective, she said, locating his purpose without waiting for it to arrive. You are here about Miss Moretti. I am sorry. When I heard, you declined to handle a mirror, Valley said. I declined to set a number on it, Caruso corrected gently, which in this city is the same as refusing to be the midwife of a sale. It is not that the mirror is not valuable. It is that the sort of value it has is misbehaved. She led him into the back, where work tables held fragments of history. A drawer of brass escutcheons, a circle of cracked varnish under glass, a wooden panel face down on felt. On one wall, shelves of ledgers and boxes, the sort that have no names on the spine because the hands that reach for them already know where they are. May I? Valley asked, nodding at his notebook. Of course. Caruso pulled a folder from a stack and set it down between them. She sent photographs of the mirror 2 weeks ago, full frontal, frame close-ups, detail of the silver. I did what one does, brightness and contrast to see beneath the apparent surface, oblique light to bring up the imperfections. There were fewer imperfections than the age would permit. Restored. Recently, Caruso said, but not professionally, or at least not in the ways professionals brag. The silver had been rebacked in places. And here, she tapped a printout of a high-resolution image, where the frame's inner lip showed a narrow shadow of the kind only craftsmen and detectives get excited about. Scratches. Small. Too deliberate to be accident. Their spacing is almost metronomic. The first thing a restorer is trained out of is leaving marks of his own pattern. We are trained to be the end of the story, not an author inside it. What did you tell her? That the mirror is 17th century Florentine work, Caruso said. Carved gilt wood, good hand, not court quality but ambitious. That the silver may be original in parts, which is interesting. That there are traces of mercury, which is concerning, and means any intervention must be cautious. That the provenance is unclear, which affects the number. And that there is a reputation attached.
De asterisco specchio del traditore asterisco punto.
Caruso's mouth tilted. We use such names as shorthand for a cluster of anecdotes. The term appears in a police log from 1894, a boarding house near San Lorenzo. A tenant stabbed another in a room with a large mirror the landlady claimed to have acquired from a servant's sale of a minor Medici property. The witness said the mirror showed the man even before he moved. The description of the frame is plausibly similar. It appears again in an 1897 letter from a priest to a restorer. He asks whether the traitor's mirror should be shrouded after a death, as was custom in some houses, lest it retain the passing. The restorer replies that shrouding does nothing to furniture except calm the living. Valley took the copies she slid across. The letter's hand was scolded onto thin paper, the ink gone brown with time. He read the priest's line twice, not for meaning but for tone. Superstition put into polite language so it could be discussed by men with education. Any modern cases? He asked. Caruso considered. A crime scene photograph in 1957, mentioned in a small journal of the time. I don't have the actual plate, only a Xeroxed reproduction that could be a poor shadow of anything. The article suggests a reflection confused the court enough to acquit a man who should perhaps have been questioned harder. It is cited occasionally by enthusiasts of locked-room puzzles who prefer their puzzles tragic. Nothing I would present in a talk to people who enjoy being agreed with. And yet you told Renata. I told her because she collects stories as much as she collects pieces, Caruso said. Sometimes she sells the story and the object hitches a ride. I thought she should know that if she took this to auction, the wrong kind of buyer would elbow to the front, those who bid on drama. I prefer old things to find homes with patience. Did she mention a buyer? She hinted at interest from a man in Milan with a gallery that specializes in objects with aura, which is the sort of phrase that serves as both admission and apology. She also asked if there was any record of the mirror being tied directly to a Medici household. There is not in my files, though that means little. The Medicis shed furniture like forests shed leaves. Why did you decline? Caruso folded her hands. Because when I looked at the image long enough, I saw my face in the silver. I do that often. Mirrors make you see yourself, this is not mystical. But here I found that the feeling of being observed did not retreat when I changed angle or light. That is not a measurable factor. It is not even advisable to tell a detective. But you asked. I asked, Valley said. He had come to trust the useless report of sensation when it came from people who had trained their senses to be useful. Did you tell her about the marks under the silver? I told her not to attempt any cleaning. She assured me she would bring it in properly. The next day she wrote to postpone. Then I heard the news. The bell in the front room sounded. A client's voice, delicate with money. Caruso looked toward the door and then back to Valley. One more thing, she said quickly. There is a restorer named Keller, German by origin, Florentine by choice, who has made a study of mercury-silvered glass. If you must take the mirror from the wall, do it under his eye. He is careful in the way of people who have broken something once and learned to live with the memory. Hans Keller, Valley said, hearing the name as if it had already been in the file.
Thank you, dottoressa.
When he left the studio, the day had thickened. He walked with the folder under his arm and the idea of scratches under silver in his head. He called the office and asked for any insurance documentation on the building that might mention fixed furnishings. He asked them to reach out to the Milan gallery with aura problems. He asked them to schedule Keller for an examination of the mirror and to prepare a portable UV setup. Back at the flat, the mirror waited as if it had no other appointment in the world. The scene team had obeyed him without zeal. No bolts disturbed, no brackets loosened, only measurements and photographs. He put on gloves and leaned in close to the frame's inner edge, following the faint ticks like a man counting a rosary he did not believe in. They were not placed for the eye but for the hand. A tally kept where the counter would know to reach. Do you see it? He asked the tech, who joined him with a macro lens. Regular intervals, she said. Some clustered, some solitary. The pattern repeats in 3 quadrants, but not the 4th, where the silver is newer. As if someone started over when the backing changed. Numbered days, Valley murmured. Visits? Restorations? Or not numbers at all, hatch marks to build a face, like the first strokes of an etching. Faces? The tech said, skeptical but willing to be bribed by the thrill of a good story. In a mirror? In the backing, Valley said, where the silver drinks the words and does not give them back. He asked her to shoot the edge under raking light, then again under UV. A lamp hummed and coughed out an artificial dusk, and under it the ticks gathered into hesitant filaments, like veins drawn by a nervous student. In two places, the lines converged into something that wanted to be a jaw. He told himself it was apophenia, the brain making saints out of stains on the wall. He told himself other things, too, none of them comfortable. His phone buzzed. The auction house had replied to a probe the office sent. Renata had booked a preliminary appraisal slot for the following week and then canceled with a note. Object has a difficult history. May seek private sale. The specialist who wrote back added a single sentence Valley read twice to be sure it meant what it meant. We have been advised informally that the mirror has a storia de mort, a history of death. He stood in front of the glass and looked at himself, looking at the words on his phone reflected in his own hand. Behind his shoulder, the door waited to be a door. He pocketed the phone and said, to no one he would admit to later, all right, old things have their moods. Some also keep their books. Sophia Caruso agreed to meet again that evening, after clients had thinned and the city's sounds took on the velvet of after hours. She ushered Valley into her back room with the economy of motion that comes from a lifetime of carrying things that should never be dropped. I pulled what I could, she said, setting a stack of folders and 2 archival boxes on the table. Stories travel badly unless someone forces them into paper. Fortunately, Florence has always had a surplus of clerks. Valley took the top folder. A photocopy of an 1894 police entry had the staccato tone of a clerk writing what he does not believe but also does not wish to be wrong about. Boarding house, San Lorenzo Quarter. Quarrel over rent. A man stabbed from behind in a narrow room that contained a bed, a washstand, and a mirror of notable size with frame gilded. One witness. The landlady, who claimed she saw 2 men in the glass when only one stood in the room. The accused was released faute de proofs, for lack of proof. The note in the margin, in a different hand, read, Specchio del Traditore? Trader's Mirror? You see how the term arrives, Caruso said. Not in a chronicle or a poem, where it could breathe. In a margin, whispers do not trust the main text. The second folder contained a letter from 1897. A priest writing to a restorer whose shop once stood where a leather boutique now performs its rituals. The priest describes a death. A tenant, a fall, perhaps not accidental. He asks whether it is proper to shroud a mirror that has received the last sight of the sinner, in order to keep the room clean of his passage. The restorer's reply is sensible and a little weary. Shrouding might console the living but changes nothing in the chemistry of silver. Valley let the paper lie under his palm a moment, the way one tests a stone for warmth. Have you seen the mirror, in person, any time before this week? Caruso shook her head. Only in photographs Miss Moretti sent, and those told me enough to decline. The frame is mid-17th century. See the acanthus, see the restraint. We like to imagine all Baroque carving ran amok, but this one was made by a hand that knew when to stop. But the silver, she made a small face. It has been interfered with, rebacked perhaps 3 times. The most recent layer may date to the 1950s, when mercury silvering was already out of fashion and out of law. Either some careless traditionalist did it in a garage, or someone thought nostalgia exempt from safety. Mercury traces, Valley said. Our opticians saw them. They would account for the mirror's unusual brightness, and for the headaches the careless sometimes report after polishing old glass. More to the point. She slid over a high-resolution printout and pointed to the inner lip of the frame. Here, the scratches you mentioned. I enhanced them under oblique light. You can tell when a line is impatient. These are not. They were made by a hand that knows repetition. Restoration graffiti is not unheard of. A conservator mid-century, marking progress in the only place he thinks no one will check. Or, Valley said, because any sentence with that hinge deserved its other half. Or someone used the back of the frame as a place to practice a face, Caruso said, surprising herself with the sentence. She placed a second printout beside the first, this one stitched together from overlapping macro shots. Under the ultraviolet wash, the ticks and crosshatches shifted toward legibility. Not a portrait, not that kind of confidence. But the human brain recognizes curvature, eyes even when none are there. A jaw suggested, the shadow of a cheek that could have been anyone's. You see why I told her no, Caruso said. Sometimes you decline not because an object lacks value, but because the kind of value it has will invite the wrong sort of attention. The wrong sort. Collectors who want to own consequences, she said. Men who will hang a story because the story displaces the work of having a life. Valley paged through the rest. There was a 1957 clipping from a thin circulation journal, La Scena del Delitto, a quarterly printed for an audience of cops and attorneys and their sober cousins. The article was brief. A locked room stabbing in an apartment near Porta Romana. A mirror confused the eye so that a form appeared where the man could not be. The photographs had aged into mush, but the composition was familiar. A gilded frame showing more than the room itself allowed. Do you believe any of it? Valley asked. I believe objects acquire reputations by doing little more than being present, Caruso said. Which is to say, I believe in people. I believe in the human need to push blame a little outside the body, where it can be negotiated with. I also believe in eyes. The eyes say this mirror is old, particular, interfered with, and that someone, sometime, spent enough hours facing it to leave marks in the one place he could. She hesitated, then added, almost wry, I believe in headaches. He closed the folder. You told Renata the same. I did, she said. I also told her that if she insisted on an auction, she would do better by tying it to the Medici servants' quarters, the part of the legend that offends least. It gives buyers a palace without too much blood. Did she insist? She flirted with insisting the way one flirts with a cliff, Caruso said. She liked daring until it required her to fall. She said she might seek a private sale instead. I suspected she had a name already. The Milan Gallery. A man who calls himself a curator and behaves like a playwright, Caruso said. He buys the idea of an object and expects the object to keep up. Valley let that settle. The detective's work was often the unglamorous business of rephrasing, turning rumors into questions, questions into requests, requests into files. But sometimes a case carried its own architecture. Here, an ancient surface, a modern death, a photograph whose truth outpaced the room. He felt the outline of a pattern seeking him. May I borrow the copies? He asked. Keep them, she said. They will not thank me by returning. When he stepped back into the street, the air had cooled, the kind that feels objective. He walked with the folder tucked under his arm and turned into a bar near the Questura that understood police appetites. Simple food, quick coffee, no questions. He ate standing, thinking about the boarding house in 1894, the priest, the restorer who wrote like a man who did not have time for ghosts. He called the records office. I need the originals on a pair of old cases, he said. San Lorenzo, 1894. Porta Romana, 1957. Any mention of a gilded mirror, large, resident in the room. If they're moldering, wake them. If they're filmed, pull the reels. Tonight. The clerk made a noise like a page turning. Tonight. Old things have their moods, Valley said. They also have a schedule. I want to be waiting when they arrive. He went back to the flat on Via della Pergola without quite deciding to. The hall smelled of soap and someone's dinner working through tomatoes. He let himself in and stood with the lights off. The mirror held what little the streetlights offered and made more of it, the way good glass does. His reflection was a gray animal with patient eyes. He thought of the landlady's men in 1991 and their rope, baffled by handmade screws that refused to concede to modern wrenches. He thought of a restorer in the 1950s, perhaps in a back room that smelled of solvent and orange peel, lifting the frame's lip and working a tool in the dark where no client would think to look. He imagined the small sound of a blade against wood as someone, without admitting it to himself, made a mark for every visit, every hour, every face the mirror seemed to suggest if you stared long enough. His phone buzzed, Keller confirming he could meet in the morning with UV gear and a respect for mercury. Don't move it, Keller wrote. We'll take its pulse where it hangs. Valley texted back a single word. Agreed. He turned on the lamp nearest the console. The light drew a clean line across the floor, and the mirror returned it as if proud of its schooling. He pulled a chair and sat facing it the way one sits across from a witness who has never spoken and never will. "Specchio del traditore," he said softly, tasting the stupid melodrama of naming a thing that cannot hear. "Show me a traitor." Nothing changed. Good. He preferred his monsters to have patience. The city outside dragged a bus along the curb, scissoring light briefly across his hands. In the glass, the door behind him stayed a door. He thought of the American tourist and the way she had described the man in the reflection noticing her, the small unkindness of being looked at by someone about to do harm. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the function of a mirror is not to tell us what is there, but to show us what we are willing to recognize. The phone rang again. Records. "We found microfilm on the 57. You'll want to see it," the clerk said. "The plate is damaged, but the frame, well, it's interesting. The older one will take longer." "I'll be in the archives in 20 minutes, Valley said, already standing. He killed the lamp. The mirror stalled for a breath in the dark and then became simply the heaviest thing in the room. He closed the door behind him, and this time, as the latch caught, he watched the silver just long enough to know he was being watched in return. By his own outline, by old glass, by the suggestion that certain surfaces do not forget. He took the stairs down 2 at a time, like a man leaving a church after lighting a candle he doesn't admit to. The night received him without comment. The archives would have their boxes waiting, and inside them would be the slow handwriting of clerks who, without meaning to, had kept a path open for him. He turned toward the river and the building with windows that never quite go dark. The case had a shape now. He intended to press it until it answered with dates and keys and the human solution every legend tries to disguise. Florence keeps the bones of its paperwork under the earth. The municipal archives lived in a building that had once held salt and now held explanations, the kind of trade that makes a city honest. A clerk with hair like a bristle brush led Valley into a cool room where the past breathed through cardboard and cotton gloves. He signed for the reels, the sort of ritual he enjoyed. A name on a line, a date in a box, the sense of stepping from rumor to record. The microfilm reader hummed with the same small obstinacy as a refrigerator at night. Valley threaded the reel for 1957, rolled past births and building permits until the frames changed tone. Asterisk Porta Romana. Homicide. Summer heat like a sermon. Asterisk the accompanying report sat under a lens. Typed, rubber-stamped, amended in handwriting that had learned to be tidy out of fear of authority. He read slowly, teeth worrying the inside of his cheek the way they did when he walked a familiar street with a new thought. The victim was a seamstress named Elena Baldi. One room, a skylight, a window facing a courtyard shaped like a well. The body was found on the floor beside her Singer machine. Single wound, posterior skull. No weapon recovered. Door bolted. Latch set. The landlady had opened with a duplicate key after neighbors complained of the smell. 3 days in July will do a thing to the air. On the wall opposite the Singer, a mirror of notable size with frame gilded. Condition good, glass bright. The photographer's plate numbers marched along the margin like a squad. The photographs had not aged well. Emulsion is mortal, but sometimes destruction performs a favor. It reduces detail to composition until all you can see is what matters. In the first image, the mirror stood centered, catching the far corner of the room and the generous rectangle of the window. In the second, the angle shifted as the photographer moved, impatient with his own caution. In the third, something happened, motion blur, a smear that could have been an artifact or a man retreating from the frame into the dark where plates cannot follow. The report's author wrote with the resignation of a man who had explained things to juries. The reflection is a judge to have introduced ambiguity as to the presence of a second figure. The acquittal had turned on a procedural error, but the article in the thin journal, asterisk la scena del delitto asterisk, had indulged the romance of a form that appeared where the man could not be. Valley looked at the plate, then at the words, then at the plate again, because a detective's superstition is to let his eyes outvote a sentence twice before he agrees with it. He made notes in his careful hand. Mirror similar by description. Locked room. Posterior wound. No weapon. Reflection confusion. He sketched the room from memory of the photos. Machine here, window there, mirror opposite. If someone had stood in the corridor outside and thrust a blade quickly through the door at a gap. No, bolt set. Skylight? Too small for entry or exit. Rope? None mentioned. The old solutions had been examined and found theatrical. He rewound 1957 and threaded 1894. The frames juddered older film, less patient machinery. The clerk had warned that much of the material had been transferred from brittle originals by a man with a steady hand but no funding. Still, the gist held. Boarding house, San Lorenzo. A narrow room with a bed that knew more stories than its linens would ever tell. The landlady claimed that in the mirror she saw two men where there had been one. The clerk's note in the margin. Asterisk Spiccio del Traditore? Asterisk. Had smeared into a ghost of ink, but it remained legible, like a whisper under a breath. There were no photographs, only a pencil sketch made at the inquest, a diagram of such precision it bordered on modest art. Whoever drew it understood space. The mirror's frame was rendered with enough care to suggest someone had been a little in love with it. Valley traced the dimensions against a ruler printed on the page. Tall, much taller than the men. The bed reflected as a narrow rectangle slicing the glass at mid-height. No way in, no way out. The comfort of impossible rooms is that they make criminals into magicians until you remember the trick is small and close to the hand. He closed his notebook and sat back, letting the dark of the reader hold his reflection as a pane of black. Patterns are dangerous. They invite conclusion before evidence. But the parallels refused to be polite coincidences. The mirror did not only decorate these rooms. It witnessed them in the bureaucrat's plain language, furnishing present, and in the folkloric voice that slips into margins when the main text is shy. The clerk brought him a box of supplementary materials, typed interviews, receipts. On top lay a letter from 1974, when the building on Via della Pergola had been renovated. It was a contractor's invoice, annotated by Signor Berti, the owner who loved theater. Asterisk, do not remove the large mirror in the second-floor front room. Reinforce bracket. Wall to be replastered around object. Costs to be billed as part of structural work. Asterisk Valley smiled without humor. There it was. An instruction to treat the antique not as furniture but as a fixture, as if it had grown there like a column. He made copies, signed his name again, boxed the past, and carried it up into the warmer air. On the steps he paused, phone to his ear. Keller, he said when the man answered. We move on the mirror in the morning. I want optical tests, polarized light, UV, any laser scan you can do in situ. I want to know if the silver is single or layered, and whether there's lamination that could behave like a lens. I want microscopy on the backing, and I want to know why I can see more in it than I should. Keller's voice had the calm of a man who preferred the quiet company of instruments. We will treat it as a patient, he said. But remember, a patient is also a person. Mirrors are liars by design. They reverse. They compress distances. They are flat but not simple. If someone wanted to teach a room to misbehave, a mirror is an excellent accomplice. A beam splitter? Valley said, half joking, because jokes are bridges between disciplines. A periscope built into 17th century silver? Not impossible that a later restorer added something, Keller replied, not taking the bait, because good scientists carry the word impossible like a fragile thing. But unlikely. Mercury-silvered glass is not a lens unless shaped. We will test angles and see what the room permits. Bring masks, Valley said. Lucia's plasterers got headaches. I always bring masks, Keller said, and hung up with the confidence of a man who believed procedures could hold back the sea. Valley walked out into a night that had put on its cooler jacket. He called the office and asked an analyst to pull the tourist's raw image files and run them through every check they had. Error level analysis, sensor pattern noise, check for compositing. Assume no fraud, he said, but try to prove me wrong. He asked another to draft requests to the utility company for power fluctuations in the building. A trick of current can make a lamp flicker at a rhythm that convinces the animal part of the brain something has moved. He returned to the flat on Via della Pergola with the city amused at his hurry. Florence never seems to run, it merely adjusts its stride. Lucia had left a note on the door. Cleaner will not come until the police say the room is no longer. And then a blank where she had run out of language. He let himself in, hit the switch, and watched the mirror take the light and distribute it like a banker skimming a tithe. He stood at varying distances, the way a man tastes soup with different spoons. 3 meters, the room resolved. 2. The flaws in the silver declared themselves as stars. 1. His own face became an argument. He lifted his hand and moved the penlight in a slow arc. The reflection's edge did not shiver. Old glass often breathes at its perimeter. This one behaved like polished stone. He crouched and examined the wall bracket with a jeweler's loupe. Handmade screws, yes, heads slightly off-center as though an old blacksmith had chosen function over vanity. The wood backing bore the mark of a restorer's chisel and the paler bite of newer plaster. One bracket had a faint stain of rust transferred onto the gilding, a smear at the level where a blade could touch if someone, in a specific position, had brought metal close to the glass. He measured. The rust smear sat at exactly the height Renata would have stood if she were reading at the console. He drew a line through air from that point across his shoulder to the door behind him. The geometry that governed rooms refused to be overruled, but it did not complain about being tested. He tried rationalities on like coats. A projection, rear or front, the walls would tell on the equipment. None. A prank with glass, no second pane, no angle for a Pepper's ghost. A hole in the wall, he tapped, listened. The plaster answered like a solid citizen. Ghosting on the lens fine, but the DSLR's metadata and the sequence of shots did not favor it. A person hidden, there were not the centimeters needed for a human being to existing between frame and wall. Tampered negatives, a modern digital workflow made that a different beast, and the tourist carried the innocence of someone whose surprise had not yet learned performance. He sat. The mirror offered him the room where a woman had been alive until she was not. You learn, after years of proximity to endings, to feel the way a room has changed temperature around an absence. He felt it now, the slightly more present air that follows violence, as if molecules refuse to disperse the story they have been told. His phone bleeped with an incoming from records. Another hit tangential to 1894. A note from 1901 about a fight in a tenement off via Guelpha. Polizia intervened. No death. Woman reported mirror making faces. Saw my dead husband raise a knife. The officer on the scene had written a line Valley respected for its sanity. Recommend removal of mirror to prevent further trouble. Landlord refused on grounds of cost. A city's official voice, choosing money over the prevention of madness. A pattern does not need a murder every time to keep itself alive. He put his palms on his knees and reminded himself of discipline. There are 2 temptations a detective must refuse: the rush to an elegant, unbelievable solution, and the resentful trudge toward the dullest possible answer. Between is the ground where truth grows, if you water it with checks. He called Keller again, left a message with the extra note about the rust at the lower edge. He texted the lab to prep for trace metal analysis from the gilding, in case those iron oxides on glass matched the alloy of a blade someone owned. He asked the unit to pull vendor receipts from Renata's recent weeks for solvents, cloths, anything that would suggest she had been polishing the mirror more than usual. People polish things when they expect to sell them, or when they have begun to believe those things talk back. He stood, finally, and faced the glass as if it were a person to whom one owes a good question. "How many rooms have you built?" he asked. A foolishness he permitted because sometimes questions breed answers in the air even when the addressee cannot respond. The mirror held him, and in the armature of his own reflected shoulders he thought, for an indecent fraction of a second, he saw another posture assemble. A man whose head was slightly more bowed than his, whose right hand had learned the weight of a thin blade. Reflex turned him. The room remained itself. When he looked back, his reflection had resumed its one-body discipline, and the door behind him was only a door. He exhaled through his teeth. "Enough," he said, to himself as much as to the temper of the place. He took out his phone and sent the formal order. Asterisk mirror to be tested on site by optician and forensic team at 9 o'clock. Full optical workup. UV polarized. Raking. Microetch survey. No movement without structural assessment. Treat as hazardous mercury. Asterisk. On his way out he paused, hand on the switch. In the half-second between light and dark, the surface seemed to deepen, as though silver remembers better when asked to be night. He closed the door and locked it with the temporary police cylinder, feeling in his pocket for the weight of the key as if weight were proof of control. Out in the corridor, a floorboard complained. The lemon tree in the courtyard below had shut its leaves for the evening, the way living things do when they are allowed to. Valley took the stairs, slower this time. He had the pattern he needed, 1894, 1957, now. A mirror in each, not decorating but anchoring the case. Tomorrow he would put science against superstition and see which yielded first. They met at 9, the hour when professionals still believe in procedures. Keller arrived with a rolling case that looked like it had once flown business class and then learned humility. He was broad-shouldered in a way that made door frames nervous, but he moved with the courtesy of a person who has apologized to too many objects to risk one more. He greeted Lucia with a nod, Valley with a firm, dry hand, and the mirror with a brief moment of stillness that read as respect. "Mercury-silvered glass," he said, before anyone asked, voice soft as if a raised tone could pit the surface. "We treat it as we would a patient with a history. Masks on. Gloves always. No solvents unless I say. We are here to learn the room before the room learns us." The evidence techs had already sheeted the floor with paper and taped off a rectangle like a stage. Keller unpacked his case onto a side table. A UV lamp with a hood, a set of raking lights on adjustable stands, a loop with a Vulgarian's magnification, a handheld spectrometer the size of a book, swabs, slides, a digital microscope with a camera that could force an ant to confess. He placed a small box apart from the rest and clicked it open to reveal masks with filters. "We will not polish," he said, looking at the mirror as if it might be tempted. "We will not breathe ambition at the silver." The room adjusted to this new ritual the way rooms do when purpose arrives. Valley stood a step back from the active space, notebook open, pen poised harmlessly over lines. Keller began with the courtesy exam. A cool inspection of frame and bracket, murmuring measurements to the tech who wrote them down. He touched gilding with the pad of a gloved finger and made a sound that could have been approval. "Good leaf," he said. Not courtly but not provincial. Someone who had finesse but also a deadline. He knelt at the lower edge where Valley had noticed the rust smear and held the loop in place. "Yes," he said, adjusting focus until the lens's own impatience calmed. "Iron oxide, very faint, transferred to the gilding. Could be a tool. Could be the head of a screw brushed there. But it sits at a height consistent with a slender blade being drawn close to the glass." "Trace sample?" Valley asked. Keller nodded to the tech, who lifted a scalpel as if it were a prayer and coaxed a ghost of pigment from gilding to a sterile slide. "We will not take more," Keller said. "The rest will do with light." He drew the blinds until the room's day thinned to a useful dusk. He set the raking lights low and walked them in, one at a time, until the surface gathered shadow along its scratches, the way topography declares itself when the sun is near the horizon. Under oblique light, the frame's inner lip came alive. The faint ticks Valley had seen now marched in disciplined irregularity. Keller made a small pleased noise. "Not accidental, not random. The hand is calm." He moved to the back, where the frames would met the wall. He angled one light to creep under the lip, then added the UV lamp's cold hum. The silver drank and then returned the wavelengths with the brazen honesty of ultraviolet. No poetry, only admission. Where the naked eye had seen ticks, the camera found filaments. The tech captured images as Keller adjusted the lamp in millimeters, coaxing lines from quiet to speech. On the laptop, the composite built itself like a map of a city that had been erased and redrawn. Crosshatches gathered into almost faces, not portraits but suggestions, the sort of thing a suspect mind would make if it had been left alone too long with a surface that wanted to be more than surface. Keller stilled the image and overlaid a grid. "Here," he said. He pointed to a constellation of lines that aligned with the human urge to see eyes and jaw. "And here, and give me that quadrant, yes." He toggled through wavelengths. Let the stains of age push forward. Beneath one set of hatch marks, ghosted under later scrapes, sat a curve that knew it was a mouth. Restoration graffiti? Valley offered. Keller didn't answer immediately. He toggled again, eyes traveling in a steady path a surgeon would recognize. Possibly, but the spacing is obsessive. A restorer will sometimes notch, yes, to mark a section, to count passes of paper or cloth. These extend across intervals where no hand should reach if the man's goal were only polish. And, look here. He zoomed on a corner of the inner lip that the last resilvering had not reached, a tiny peninsula of original layer spared by neglect. Under UV, the older silver glowed differently, an undersea fluorescence. On its back, where would met mercury, were marks whose depth was grain-soft. These are in the wood, not only in the silver. They predate at least one rebacking. How far back? Valley said. Keller frowned at the image, the kind of frown that precedes good news or a need to abjure certainty. Dating scratches is a parlor trick, but oxidation on the exposed micro-edges suggests age. And here, see this brown? He pointed to a stain adjacent to a cluster of marks. Animal glue bleed, 19th century, by its color and fracture. The marks sit beneath a film of that glue. That means at least some scratches were there before a 19th century intervention. Valley felt a small cold clarity. So whoever cut those lines did so before the 1890s repairs, before the boarding house case. Some did, Keller allowed. Others ride on top. We have layers of the same hand or hands, reaching across decades. Lucia hovered in the doorway like a penitent landlord. Is it safe? She asked the room, and meant more than mercury. Safer than some people, Keller said, not unkindly. Unsafe if asked to be something it is not. He turned the UV away and brought up the spectrometer. He took readings along the mirror's surface, muttering numbers that to Valley sounded like a steady confession. Silver percentage, oxide presence, stray metals. Mercury residues present in backing and at edges, he said. No surprise. The brightness would be a function of that and of aggressive cleaning. He paused near the lower edge where the rust smear lived. The device chirped. Iron trace on the glass itself, not only gilding. Very slight, enough to shadow a touch. If a blade kissed the glass there, it left a molecule of a memory. Can we say what kind of blade? Valley asked. We can say iron-based steel of a kind used in many knives, Keller said. Too generic to point a finger. He set the spectrometer aside and bent to the lens. We will try reflected light microscopy, he said, lover's calm. The microscope, perched on a stand designed to straddle frames without injuring them, brought the surface close enough to see arrogance in the polish. At 1200 times, the world became a city of scars. The silver's microtopography flattened in places where an impatient cloth had pressed too hard. Between those planes, the tiniest grooves ran, in parallel like furrows, then crosswise as if a hand had turned and turned again. Paper, Valley said. Paper, Keller confirmed. Mid-century grit. Not the 19th century tendency to use Tripoli or Rottenstone alone. Someone in the 50s or 60s made this surface flatter than it should be, then finished with wool. He left his rhythm behind. He clicked capture and saved the image. They took breaks like medics. Water, air at the window, a brief human sentence to remind themselves that language was possible. In the second hour, Keller tried something Valley did not expect. He set up 2 polarizing filters, one on the light and one on the camera, and rotated axes to kill glare. The mirror sulked and then conceded. Subsurface structures lifted as if embarrassed. In the dead center of the glass, invisible before, a faint ellipse suggested a repair. A button of newer silver dovetailed under older. There, Keller said, pleased, an island, resilvered from behind, perhaps to obliterate something in that zone or to repair a small blackening. Whoever did it was tidy. The seam is good. He rotated again. The island darkened and blended back. Could an inserted layer behave like a lens? Valley asked. No, Keller said. Flat upon flat. A lens needs curve. But a resilvered patch can behave like a better mirror inside a worse one. It can dominate the image in that region. If the angle brings a figure through that ellipse, it might appear with more contrast. Valley thought of the tourist's photograph, the man's raised arm, the knife's thin geometry. Show me the ellipse again. They mapped its position relative to the frame, then measured from the floor. A height that matched Renata's skull if she had been standing with her attention bent toward the papers on the console. Keller marked the measurements with tape that would not mark, the way a good doctor marks a surgical site twice though he already knows it by heart. The tech switched the UV back on for a grand tour. In the composite that bloomed on the screen, the hatch marks finally yielded their pattern. Not a single face, no clean outline to satisfy a courtroom. Rather, layers, like the palimpsest of a life sketched over, erased, and resketched. Here an implied brow. There a shallow oval where cheeks might be if someone was bad at cheeks. And in one quadrant, Keller froze the image, zoomed, enhanced without lying. A curve that any human eye would read as the long line of a jaw meeting the angle beneath an ear. A small mole, or the ghost of one, where skin would show it if skin were present. Coincidence, Keller said dutifully. Valley's mouth had gone dry in the exact, annoying way mouths go dry when nerves try to perform for the room. Renata had a mark here, he said, touching his own jaw in the place he remembered from the photograph she'd once provided for an ID card at the auction house. A beauty mark the size of a poppy seed. We cannot date the scratch that makes that dot, Keller cautioned. We can only observe its position. But, he toggled layers back, looking for an order. This sits under a film of age. Under the glue bloom here. It is not modern. How not? Not yesterday, Keller said. Not 2 weeks ago. Long enough for oxidation to dress the cut. They were quiet. The building made a small wooden confession. Outside, a bell closed the hour gently so as not to bruise it. Keller broke the pause with the mercy of a practical man. We come now to interpretation, he said. The dangerous part. We can say, the mirror has been resilvered and polished multiple times. We can say, beneath the inner lip of the frame, in wood and in silver, there are marks by a deliberate hand or hands across at least a century. We can say, some of those marks, under UV and raking light, conspire with the human tendency to find faces to suggest faces. We can say, iron traces sit on the glass and gilding at the lower edge, consistent with brief contact with a blade of ordinary steel. We can say, a resilvered ellipse in the center could give stronger contrast to an image passing through that zone. And we can say, Valley added, not ready to let the mercy stand alone, that one of those suggested faces wears a mark where the victim wore one, and the mark appears to predate her by decades. Keller looked at him and let his mouth tip a fraction. We can say it appears so on a screen. I will not say more. Mirrors breed certainty too easily. Valley nodded, grateful for the break. He stepped back, taking the room into him the way a man takes air after being underwater. The console, stripped of clutter. The vase bagged and gone. The mirror, calm and efficient, doing its old work of returning light as if it were a favor it might one day call in. He thought of the boarding house in 1894, the seamstress in 1957, of marks laid into wood before any of them, the counting of someone's hours in front of the silver, the way a man trapped in a habit will mark days on a cell wall. He pictured Renata planning to sell a story and its surface together, then hesitating. Who had spent enough time with the mirror recently to leave new marks among the old. Who had leaned close, seen themselves, and found the urge to cut a line in the one place no client would inspect. Who had brought a blade close enough to kiss the gilding, to leave iron's ghost on gold. Keller was packing, repacking, the ritual of tools returning to their temporary homes. I will write you a report fit for court, he said. It will be careful and boring. Good, Valley said. Boredom is a tonic. He looked once more at the screen, at the vague jaw swung under UV like a promise. Inspiration is a vice. He had learned to keep it on a short chain. But some feelings haunt whether you invite them or not. A face hinted in scratches older than a victim. A blade's memory on glass. A resilvered island ready to make a figure crisp. He closed his notebook. The case felt slightly heavier in his hand. Outside, the street had decided on noon. If a murder can be premeditated by a room, he said, almost to himself. We are late. Keller pretended not to hear, because science is kind enough to ignore poetry when it starts to think it's evidence. He snapped his case shut and nodded toward the door. Tomorrow, he said, we test what the cameras see when the room is asked to misbehave on command. Valley stood alone for a breath after they left, the way you stand after a doctor has told you what is true and also what he refuses to guess at. He faced the mirror until his own reflection steadied and the urge to find other men in it retreated to manners. Then he locked the door and went to find the living, because wood and silver can be patient forever, but guilt is always in a hurry. The living always explain the dead with their own needs. Valley began with the man whose need was easiest to count. Marco Leone waited in a glass office cantilevered above the auction floor like a VIP seat for misfortune. He wore a navy suit with the sheen of a good opinion of himself and a tie that looked like it had been ironed by someone paid not to ask questions. Behind him, framed posters of previous sales turned history into numbers. She was my friend, he said, before the handshake completed. The phrase hit the glass and slid down. You were partners, Valley said. In deals, not a company. She brought objects, I brought buyers. A handshake and a commission. You know how it is. Florence runs on reputations and fractions. How much does a mirror with an anecdote fetch? Valley asked. Leone smiled with his mouth only. Depends on the buyer. If he wants a mirror, 10,000, 12. If he wants to own a story, 50. If he thinks he can tell the story better than anyone else, more. And the commission? 10% each way, Leone said, casual. To bring the seller to the buyer's ear and the buyer to the seller's patience. You stood to gain, Valley said, letting the arithmetic sit between them like a consenting adult. Leone spread his hands. From a sale that had not yet occurred. You pushed for it, though. I encouraged Renata to bring it to auction, he admitted, because that's the ecosystem. She hesitated. She wanted a private sale to a gallery in Milan. I advised against it. Those men like to buy aura and pay in fog. Which men? Leone flicked a business card across the desk with a magician's aim. A gallery name in serif, a director's name that tried on importance at breakfast. He called me, not the other way around. He knew about the mirror before I did. Miss Moretti was not shy when she smelled a number. Where were you yesterday at 2 in the afternoon? In a meeting, Leone said, too quickly. Here, we have logs, cameras. There were 3 of us. Names, Valley said. He wrote them down. The camera angle from the office ceiling would show a neat tableau of men demonstrating business to each other. Leone kept his face composed, but his hands had a small, repetitive ambition to line up the edge of a stack of consignment forms with the edge of his desk. Men reveal themselves in margins. Did you ever visit Miss Moretti's flat? Valley asked. To view the mirror? Once, Leone said. 2 weeks ago. She didn't want it moved until she had numbers in hand. I told her men who pay 50 want to touch before they buy. She said then she might keep it. A flicker crossed his expression. Annoyance, grief's cheaper cousin. We argued in the courteous fashion of people who both believe they are right. How courteous, Valley said. No shouting, no touching. Florence is small. You don't foul the water. Valley let the man go and watched him leave through the glass to a mezzanine that made men into decorative silhouettes. He had the office pull the camera footage. The timestamp bracketed 2 o'clock like a gate. Leone sat with 2 men at a table, pushed papers, drank espresso, laughed his performing laugh at 14:07, took a phone call at 14:19, looked out of the glass at the sales floor with an expression he had probably practiced, returned at 14:25. It had the satisfying smoothness of a story told in advance. Pull the raw, Valley told the analyst. Not the viewing export. Check the time base. If the system drifts or syncs with an NTP server, I want to know when. Cross with the building's router logs. The liar everyone trusts wears digits. He walked to the market where Johnny Rinaldi bang pans for a living. The kitchen was mid-lunch. Heat like a decision, steam-breathing garlic and butter, metal singing its root him. Johnny stood in the center like a conductor pretending he was a drummer. When Valley said Renata's name, the man's eyes did not do the cheap things. They stood their ground and flinched only at the end, which is a better truth than tears. We ended, Johnny said, flipping a fillet. She wanted a man who could talk about acanthus leaves and hands. I wanted a woman who would eat after midnight without photographing her plate. Was 2/3 emotion, 1/3 calculation. That's a recipe for a sauce, not a life. Were you near Via della Pergola yesterday? In this fire since noon, Johnny said, gesturing with his chin at the stove. You can ask my boss, the cashier, the fridge. The camera over the pass sees me yell at 3 waiters in a row at 14:03, 14:05, and 14:09. At 14:18, I burned my thumb and said a word I shouldn't in front of a child. Cameras lie, Valley said. Then let them lie for me, Johnny said. And for the first time a heat knot of the kitchen came into his face. I loved her, detective, in the loud way that tires people. She ended it because she said my life smelled like onions. She wasn't wrong. But I don't stab. Did she tell you about the mirror? Johnny snorted. She told me about all her mirrors. The ones in people's faces, the ones in frames. She liked to see herself in old things. It made her feel permanent. When did you last see her? 4 days ago. She came in late, sat at the bar, ordered nothing and judged the room. We were polite. She asked if I had learned to be less angry. I said I had learned to be more careful about where I put it. She left me a 20 and a smile that belonged to someone else. The footage at the restaurant did what it promised. Johnny, apron, sweat, the choreography of a man at war with the clock. 2 o'clock passed over him like a second hand on a dial. Valley filed the man under grief, not guilt, and moved on. Renata's phone offered its own biography. Messages with Leone had the texture of peers negotiating a percentage without admitting they were negotiating anything else. Messages with Johnny had the structure of 2 people deciding not to bruise each other tomorrow. The interesting thread came from an unknown number saved only as M. Asterisk seen the glass. It shows well in that light. Asterisk. We don't show the glass. The glass shows us, she had replied, indulgent with her own line. Asterisk, you will get your price if you bring it Friday. Private viewing. No publicity. Asterisk. Private means lower than public by 20%, she wrote, because romance and arithmetic can share a page. But faster than courtship, M answered. And safer than jealousy. Valley sent the number to the analyst. The return arrived with bureaucratic speed. A prepaid SIM purporting to be from Milan, the sort of digital trench coat cowards wear. The cell hit tower clusters in Florence 3 times in the last week, all within walking distance of Via della Pergola. Private sale, indeed. He met with Renata's accountant, a woman whose haircut meant business. The books were clean, lines marching like a baton drill. A flagged note in the last month marked a debt called friendly for too long. 5 figures owed to a storage facility where unlovely things waited for better seasons. A mirror fetching 50 would shoo several wolves off several porches. Motive has a way of moving furniture. Back at the Questra, the analyst handed him a diagram like a modest planetarium. Cell pings, router logs, camera time bases. The auction house system is local only, she said. Not synchronized with an external clock. It drifts, gains about 50 seconds a week. The last manual sync was 8 days ago. How did they do the sync? Receptionist punches sync to phone on an app, which is a comedy of errors, she said. Phones inherit tower time, but not all towers are punctual. I compared the office footage with the sales floor register, which prints with a thermal printer that eats time differently. Leone's meeting is real, but the stamps could be off by a minute or 2. Enough to narrow, not enough to acquit. Router. At 14:21, Leone's phone disconnects from the office Wi-Fi and reconnects at 14:26, she said. He could have stepped into the corridor to take a call, or gone to the bathroom. In a world where Renata dies at 14:17 plus or minus 3, Valley said, bathrooms become famous. He visited neighbors. A student with horn-rimmed sincerity had heard a tap like a spoon on a glass, then nothing, the kind of report that teaches a detective humility. An old woman swore a man had sung in the stairwell at 1:30, but could not commit to a melody. A courier had brought a package for 2B at 13:50 and found the hall empty. The city's witnesses did what witnesses always do: described their own day with accuracy and the crime with imagination. He returned to the room. In daylight's flattery, the mirror looked civilized. He stood close enough to see the small flaws in his own skin and thought of the marks beneath the lip, the quiet arithmetic of someone who had kept company with the glass long enough to take out a blade and make a tally where no one would see. Leon's hands on the desk, arranging edges. Johnny's thumb, blistered honesty. The Milan number, the iron on the gilding. He wrote their names on the board, not because names on board solve cases, but because order is a drug he was allowed to take at work. Lines ran between them and the mirror, between the mirror and the tourist's photograph, between the photograph and a knife that did not exist. He stood back and let the geometry accuse nobody yet. Suspects thinning, he murmured, the way one checks salt. The rational explanations had begun to wear thin where belief rubs. The mirror refused to be demoted to scenery. He felt it at his back even when he faced it. He called the team. Tonight, he said, we stop being polite. We set cameras for every angle the room can stand. We ask the mirror to show us its tricks, and we bring enough light that if it lies, the lie will sweat. He hung up and, out of habit so old it belonged to someone else, touched his jaw in the place where the UV had suggested a dot. In the glass, the gesture looked like a man checking if his face still belonged to him. Caselli liked mortuaries that smelled like antiseptic and recent decisions. She stood at the stainless table, glasses low, hair in a knot that had never learned to relax, while Renata Moretti occupied the quiet center of the room. Single strike, Caselli said, as if reading from a hymn she trusted. Posterior occipital entry, slightly right of midline. Trajectory anterior and down 5 degrees, depth 17 centimeters, give or take half a centimeter for tissue compliance. Thin blade, triangular profile, edge geometry consistent with a stiletto, primarily a thrusting weapon, narrow wound channel, minimal lateral tearing. Someone who knows how to pick a lock will appreciate a stiletto's manners. Any hesitation? Valley asked. Caselli shook her head. Committed. No sawing, no second attempt, no exploratory poke. Whoever did this already knew what success felt like. Blood pattern. Contained, she said. A shallow, tidy pool radiating outward under the hairline. The rug took most of it. No medium velocity spatter elsewhere. No cast-off on walls or console. A neat strike, straight withdrawal. If a man were standing behind her, he'd be dry except for a dime of blood where his knuckles brushed hair. Metallic trace? Valley said. We swabbed the wound edges for transferable metal, Caselli replied. Trace iron detected, barely above background. No chromium signature I'd expect from modern stainless. No vanadium, no exotic alloying. Old-fashioned carbon steel, or a blade that's seen years without a dishwasher. She held up a printed image. A cross-section from micro-CT on the skull. The bevel tells me triangular. The angle tells me a right hand. The steadiness tells me he had practiced at least once, or else he was born with an unkind gift. He filed the numbers. 17 centimeters. Triangular. Carbon steel. Right hand. A picture of a man who preferred old solutions. Back at Via della Pergola, the room received him with its neutral posture. Keller's tape marks still bracketed the resilvered ellipse like a surgeon's reminder. Valley walked the space with a tape measure and a string, the simple instruments of a man who trusts geometry more than adjectives. He anchored one end of the string at the rust smear on the gilding, iron's ghost where gold should not remember. He ran it through the resilvered ellipse, then across the distance to where Renata would have stood. The angle resolved with a discouraging elegance. The line kissed the base of the skull at the height Caselli had sung into the air. He let the string hang, humming a straightness that annoyed the room's corners. He set a laser pointer on the console and feathered it along the glass until the beam bounced from the ellipse to the chair back, to the rug. He stood where the body had been. The red dot landed where flesh had once refused to be an abstraction. Could a blade have passed between frame and glass? He asked the tech. She wedged a sliver of Teflon under the inner lip and tested. Gap is 2 millimeters, maybe 3 at the generous points, she said. Enough for the whisper of a postcard. Not enough for anything that does more than ruin a manicure. The bracket. Valley crouched at the side. Any void. No cavity larger than a mouse would consider a studio, she said. We inserted the borescope into the frame's rabbit. Dust dunes, glue stalactites, an ancient beetle's funeral. No steel. He tried other doors the mind opens when it is being chased. An ice blade, he said, because detectives have to dishonor themselves with bad ideas so the good ones can breathe. Frozen, sharpened, melted. Caselli's note arrived from the lab before his own brain could object. No unusual water content in the rug, no melt signature, no elevated humidity, no low-temperature burn on tissue. The universe sometimes takes pity and closes bad doors for you. A ceramic knife? The tech ventured, playing the same game. Hard and narrow, leaves no iron. Caselli found iron, Valley said. Old carbon whisper. He kept the thought anyway and logged it under unhelpful but polite. He walked the perimeters. Door, intact. Bolt, inside. Peephole. Standard. No scratches, no burrs, no trick. Windows. Latches engaged. No paint scabs disturbed. Skirting board, no fresh pry. Radiator. A sane piece of iron that had learned to be quiet. Ceiling, no hatch, no gallows. Floorboards, tight enough to keep secrets but not a weapon. They swept the room with a handheld metal detector, the sort that sounds like a pet with opinions. It chirped at the screws and tired of itself. No spike hidden under the floor. No narrow blade taped under the console lip. No theatricality. Maybe the knife left when the killer left, the tech said, because Occam's razor is a fashion accessory even in a locked room. And the killer left how? Valley said gently. He moved his hand, palm open, tracing the air from the console to the bolt. Unless he taught the bolt to be loyal to 2 men at once. He turned to the mirror as if it were being shy. The surface pretended to be only silver. Up close, he could see Keller's incidental universe. Microscratches marching like soldiers who lost the map. A faint veil where the UV had told a better story than daylight allowed. He imagined a man at this glass weeks ago, months, maybe in a year when a different owner had different arguments with himself, standing close enough to see his breath, taking out a thin-bladed knife not to cut flesh but to cut time into the wood under the lip. 1 stroke per hour. 1 stroke per face. This is how men build prisons without walls. The report from Trace came with bureaucratic eagerness. The iron pulled from the gilding smear looked like a low-alloy carbon steel with pearlite structures consistent with blades forged in the mid-20th century or earlier. Not stainless, not tool steel. An antique stiletto, the analyst wrote, then crossed it out and replaced it with the more boring, more valuable phrase, a narrow, triangular section blade of traditional manufacture. If the weapon had a pedigree, it belonged to the kind of man who made allowances for tradition. He knelt at the console. The surface had taken on the defensive shine of a thing that was wiped whenever life left fingerprints. Along the rear edge, almost bashful, a single score line cut across the grain. Not from moving furniture, not from a careless key. He ran a gloved finger along it. The cut sat at the exact place a knife might nick wood if drawn back hastily from a throat that had not yet decided to be a body. Bag the console's rear lip, he said. Swab for iron. Check for blood proteins even if hope is ridiculous. The test came back half an hour later like a coin that refuses to land heads or tails. Asterisk trace iron consistent with ambient contamination from room. No blood proteins detected. Asterisk if the blade had touched wood. It had touched like a gentleman. Briefly, without leaving evidence of intimacy. He considered concealment. Mirrors, like criminals and saints, are boxy. He had the team bring a portable X-ray plate and a generator that looked offended to be carried upstairs. Keller frowned but conceded. They fired low-power exposures at the frame and the wall. The images returned as pleasing ghosts. The bracket screws, the density of the gilded wood, the unromantic plaster behind. No cavity. No stashed blade singing its skeleton. He stared again at the ellipse, the re-silvered island that took contrast better, the tiny sea inside the sea. He moved with it the way a sailor moves with a familiar current, aligning his eye, the string, the measurements until the imagined path from ellipse to skull became a taut possibility. The thought arrived dressed badly and still made itself at home. The knife had entered the scene in the mirror before it entered the room. Nonsense, he told himself, inventorying the word like a contraband he refused to sell. But the string did not laugh. He had the idea, ugly and useful, to test human perception as much as optics. He asked a junior officer to stand where Renata had stood, to lean over papers, to keep her head in the posture that exposes trust. He took Valley's place behind the console and raised an unsharpened pointer, nothing more than a thin baton. In the mirror, the gesture became precise in the ellipse, too precise, like a rehearsal conducted in silver rather than air. He lowered the pointer and felt ridiculous. Ridicule has prevented more bad experiments than regulation ever will. The camera crew from forensics arrived with tripods and that earnestness men reserve for machinery. They mounted a camera opposite the mirror, a second at the side for the room's truth, a third crouched low like an eavesdropper. "We'll run all night," the lead said. "Motion detect, but also a dumb, continuous record. Infrared to keep the light polite." "Good," Valley said. "But before we let machines believe they've done our work, one more circuit." He walked the stairwell, the landing, the roof. The skylight over the neighbor's kitchen looked down like a dumb eye. Nothing that a blade could have used to fly. He checked the drains because officers learned to check drains. Clean, almost smug. He stood in the hallway and timed the latch on the door. A second to turn, another to slide the bolt. No string trick from the corridor. No hidden magnet strong enough to flirt with old iron through the wood. Back in the room, dusk had pushed its careful hand into the corners. The mirror appreciated dusk. It could pretend to be depth without lying outrageously. Valley sat in the chair again and let the day end on his watch. The camera's little LEDs winked like polite insects. He watched himself in the glass. Once, only once. He saw a line of light slide diagonally across the surface, thin and quick, like a blade catching sunset. He stood, turned, and found only the ordinary glow of a window in a building across the street where someone had decided to move a lamp. He breathed out and smiled at his own nerves. It is possible to be haunted by physics if you miss a meal. The trace report on the tourist's raw files landed in his inbox. No compositing detected. EXIF timestamps consistent. Sensor pattern noise clean. Lens aberrations normal. The man in the mirror had been captured by light that told no clever lies. He looked once more at the place where the rust kiss lived on the gilding, and then at the measurements that raced from there through the ellipse to the dead woman's skull. He thought of Caselli's 17 centimeters, of iron that remembered better than wood, of hands that didn't tremble. He thought of a knife that existed where knives should not. The tech killed the overheads and left the infrared to its slow patience. The room shrank to the working rectangle the cameras could see. Valley rubbed his jaw where a small, unimportant mark existed simply because life insists on trivia. In the mirror, the gesture looked like a man confessing to himself. "Either the weapon passed through a story," he said to the nobody who could guarantee him an answer, "or the story knows where the weapon sleeps." He locked the door and left the cameras to the night, the way one leaves a trap after admitting the animal might be cleverer than the hunter. The American backpacker met Valley at the cafe where she had taken the photograph, hands wrapped around a cup she didn't drink. Her name was Leah. She had the defensive brightness of someone who has already rehearsed being doubted. "I keep thinking I invented it," she said. "Like my camera saw something my head didn't, and then my head made it worse." "You didn't invent it," Valley said. "Your camera is rude but honest. Walk me through it again." She pointed out where she'd stood, how she'd angled up to catch the shutters. Valley had the scene team lay tape on the cobbles, marking her stance, the height of the lens, the degree of tilt. He could feel the nervous curiosity of onlookers snag against the tape like lint. Leah breathed, tried again. "I shot 3. In the second, he's there. In the third, he's not. But she's..." Leah's mouth tightened. "She's already, you know. I didn't hear anything. I felt something. That's worse. Felt what? Like when you're at a crosswalk and someone on the other side is staring, Leah said, embarrassed by her own accuracy. Like a small sunburn under your shirt. He thanked her. People who bring you the improbable deserve to leave lighter than they arrived. Back upstairs, he watched the world from the angle her lens had forced. The resilvered ellipse ate light like a better pupil. He could almost believe a stranger's gaze had traveled through that brighter patch the way sound travels through a vent. He sent the team home and stayed. The cameras blinked their machine patience. He killed the apartment's lamps and let the city's ambient glow do the work. The room took its proper proportions under dusk. Nearer, older, less willing to lie. He sat in the chair by the console, set his elbows on his knees, and let his eyes stand their watch. At 22:13, the building settled in a way that made the skirting board complain and a neighbor's radio try to remember a melody. His phone lighted with Keller's report framing numbers as obligations. He silenced it. At 23:02, a scooter carried a pair of laughing ghosts down the street. At 0:11, a woman on the floor below coughed like a promise. At 1:34, the mirror changed. Not, he would write later because later demanded tidiness, by revealing anything as simple as a man. The silver grew thick. The ellipse darkened a degree and drew the room toward itself. In that pull, a figure assembled badly. A long gray that might be a shoulder, a boundary line that could be a forearm, the idea of pacing rather than walking. He did the undignified thing and turned his head too fast. The room behind him was the usual coward. He set his eyes back on the glass. The figure kept its slow circuit behind him, confined to the ellipse so that it seemed more real in that little sea and less in the larger pane. Passed behind his chair once, twice. The second time, he felt the air on the back of his neck change temperature with the steady, stupid courage of a draft. He did not move. He lifted the penlight and flicked it once toward the door. The figure ignored him like a polite insult. "Now you notice me," he said quietly, not asking. At 1:38, his phone buzzed. The motion system had marked a change. The side camera, the truth camera, reported only Valley in a room, a steady man in a chair. The mirror camera threw lines over itself, a software attempt to box motion. The green rectangles trailed a silhouette composed of absence. He stood, finally, because men are built to prefer humiliation to fear, and turned a full half circle. The room returned the favor of being a room. When he sat again, the figure was gone. He wound the footage backward. IR glittered where dust became snow. He paused on frame 1 hour 35 minutes and 42 seconds and zoomed until pixels admitted their limits. In the ellipse, the shape had a rougher edge than electronics kites. The angle of the shoulder was wrong for his own. Longer, more determined. In the corner of the glass, over the shoulder, a brightness that wasn't lamp flare. He scrubbed forward until it went soft and then away. He texted the analyst. Asterisk flag 134 to 138. Pull difference layers. Measure motion vectors. Compare to my own. Asterisk. He made coffee the way you make penance and went back to the chair. The mirror gave him only himself now, and his himself looked like a man who had spent too long letting old surfaces tutor his nerves. 2:13, the room reset. The rectangle of the door in the reflection drew a little darker, as if a cloud had crossed a domestic sun somewhere outside. The ellipse pricked with contrast again. He didn't blink. The figure did not reappear, but the surface thickened with the promise of replay. He said, "I'm here," without meaning to. At 2:27, the mirror recorded something else entirely. It showed Renata, not cleanly, not in the miraculous vulgar way cameras prefer. But the ellipse took her like a coin sliding down a well. A posture more than a body. The slight forward bend of a woman reading her own diligence. The tilt of her head toward the papers that would outlive her. Valley watched with the absolute stillness of a man refusing to disturb a scene, even an impossible one. In the corner, then, a shadow with an arm. The arm rose. The vector was unmistakable because death is simple when you subtract panic. He stood only after the act had completed and the surface tried, clumsily, to return to being glass. He scrubbed footage again. The side camera showed nothing but a cop becoming part of a chair. The mirror camera showed a monochrome of grief. When he stilled the frame where the arm lifted, the ellipse defined the blade not as steel but as a geometry. Narrow, triangular, 17 centimeters because a corpse had told him so. He pressed his thumb to the screen, not to touch anything holy, just to measure the angle against his own nail. The phone vibrated with an incoming message. He ignored it until his eyes caught up. The analyst had sent the quick pass. Asterisk motion vectors in mirror do not correspond to your movement. Parallax inconsistent with your position. Side camera shows no moving object besides you. Timestamps clean. No dropped frames. The figure is confined to a region corresponding to the resilvered ellipse plus near surroundings. If this is an artifact, it's one I don't have a name for. Asterisk. He stood, stretched, let blood return to the parts that stay too still when the brain decides to be generous with its attention. He walked to the glass and set his fingertips against the cold, not to be foolish, but to confirm that it was, in fact, a surface. The glass returned the chill back into his bones the way good instruments do. Accurate, uninterested. Enough, he told the mirror. We will do this with company. He called the team back in the morning like a man calling a jury. They filed around the room with cables and competence. He had them arrange the tripods in a lattice. Direct to the mirror, angled to the room. A third set to capture him and Keller together because the only good companion for disbelief is a witness. Keller arrived grim with the specific delight of a scientist who expects to be told he is wrong by the universe and intends to make it formal. They ran a controlled night. Valley in the chair. Keller at the wall with a lux meter, pretending the room could be bullied into admitting how bright it was. The cameras clicked their tiny, ruthless clicks. At 2:13 again, because either the dead prefer the rhythm of old clocks or men do, the ellipse darkened, and their screens acknowledged motion. The figure paced. Keller, watching the side view, saw nothing but Valley and his own stillness. On the mirror feed, the pacing continued. Glare artifact? Keller asked, honest enough to try the dull answer first. If Glare learned choreography, Valley said. He didn't lower his voice. Artifacts don't care if you insult them. At 2:27, they watched Renata enter the scene again. Keller whispered, Jesus, in a Lutheran accent and adjusted a dial he knew would change nothing. The silhouette rose with a blade, struck, dissolved. The room did not move. The air did not shudder. Only the silver remembered, and only the cameras that watched the silver learned the memory. When they rewound, the footage did the thing software does when it feels mocked. It glitched, not by dropping frames but by refusing to forget. The reflection persisted for an extra beat after the timeline returned to zero, as if memory had inertia. Keller smacked the side of the monitor with the heel of his hand, an old superstition in new machines. He looked at Valley without comfort. This is beyond optics, he said, and the phrase had the clean relief of a confession. Or else it is optics wearing theology. Valley nodded once. He felt less triumphant than tired. The human solution had gotten smaller while the mirror became larger than furniture. He turned toward the glass and saw only his own body, with the faintest suggestion of another, badly overlaid, like a double exposure on film that had learned to dream. He sent the footage to the prosecutor with the cautionary preface, a man puts on a gift that will ruin a friendship. For the record, he described the experiment in language drier than a law book. For himself, he wrote a single line in his notebook at the bottom of the page. The mirror records guilt in a way that does not care about belief. By mid-morning, the room had gone back to being a room. The cameras blinked, bored. Keller packed with all the precision of a man rolling bandages. Valley stood by the door, the key in his pocket suddenly heavier than metal. He had thought last night that he could be haunted by physics. He realized he had found something worse. A piece of furniture that observed, and a city that had learned to live with it. They built the experiment like a courtroom that trusted machines more than men. By noon, the apartment had become a studio. Tape marks keyed the floor like a chessboard. Numbers clung to walls at measured heights. A loom of cables crawled toward a cart with synchronized recorders that stamped time with a GPS pulse every second. Keller insisted on that, no drifting clocks, no excuses. A technician from the prosecutor's office arrived with a gray suit and a frown that doubled as a chain of custody. Two independent observers from the university's optics lab stood in the doorway looking like men who had come to disprove a ghost with pencils. Principles, Keller said, ticking them off with gloved fingers. 1. Record the room from 3 angles: front, oblique, and overhead. 2. Record the mirror with 2 cameras, 1 coaxial, 1 offset, to distinguish planar artifacts from volumetric illusions. 3. Control illumination, ambient only, then constant illuminance, then step changes. 4. Mark the resilvered ellipse and mask it in some passes to test its role. 5. We all agree to touch nothing without saying so out loud into the record. Valley added one more. 6. Admissions and interpretations go into 2 different notebooks. They began with boredom, ambient light, empty room, half an hour of nothing, which is the way patience earns trust. The mirror behaved like furniture. The ellipse kept its shallow secret. Then they brought the lamps. 2 broad, high CRI panels set to 400 lux, calibrated against a meter. Keller treated like a violin. Shadows retreated in dignified order. The mirror brightened. The ellipse accepted contrast the way a throat accepts truth. Mask, Keller said. The tech lifted a removable oval of low-tack black vinyl, cut to match the resilvered island by millimeters. He pressed it to the glass delicately, a surgeon applying a false pupil. Cameras rolled. The mirror sulked. It reflected anyway. Repeat, Keller said. Ambient only. Then the panels again. Then the mask removed, the glass wiped with a single pass of anhydrous alcohol that made everyone hold their breath. At 1400 hours, they paused for air that remembered trees. The prosecutor's technician signed a log sheet as if a signature could keep the impossible from becoming embarrassing later. Night will be the truth, Valley said. Night is when the room is allowed to be itself, Keller agreed. They returned at dusk with thermoses and a kind of focus that made jokes unhelpful. A magistrate had promised to stop by briefly, which meant an hour. She arrived at 2110 with a scarf and the expression of a woman who knew she would not put the words she saw into any memo. At 2200 hours, the building settled into the hush of a thing conserving warmth. Keller dimmed the panels to a barely there glow and then killed them entirely. Only the city's throne light remained. The sodium breathed from the street, a neighbor's television flaring like distant weather. Time code aligned. The recorder announced in its polite, synthesized voice. Reference lock. Begin phase delta, Keller said. Phase delta meant they dared to court superstition with method. Valley took his place at the console, chair set at precise marks. He had shaved, not because shaving affects optics, but because ritual steadies men. The observers sat in the hall with a live view of all feeds and a sheet that let them flag moments without talking themselves into unanimity. 1:13 came and went. The room held its ordinary deceit. At 1:57, someone breathed too loudly and apologized. At 2:12, the air in the apartment shifted in that unromantic way old buildings have when temperature and pressure strike their compromise. 2:13, the mirror changed. The ellipse darkened a fractional step, hardly more than a photographer's click on a dial, and yet everything else bent toward it. The coaxial camera drew digital rectangles around motion that didn't belong to pixels making up Valley. The offset mirror camera echoed. The oblique room camera stayed bored. Mark 2 hours 13 minutes and 4 seconds. An observer said into his lapel mic, because saying the time out loud is how people prove to themselves they were present. The figure paced again. No sound, no displacement of air on the room feed, only a long absence moving like weather in the glass. It passed behind Valley's chair twice, not so much walking as translating from one useful location to another. Keller, watching levels, wrote something in his careful hand and underlined it twice. Mask, Valley said, eyes never leaving the surface. Keller gave a sharp chop of his hand. Asterisk no star. They watched. The magistrate took her scarf off and folded it as if someone had asked her to make a decision about fabric. The figure slowed. If absence can hesitate, it did. At 2:27, Renata came into the glass. A consensus of shapes, not the merciless tidiness of Hollywood. Her posture articulated itself first, the slight curve of a woman reading against her own fatigue. Valley felt his neck hair lift and ordered it down. The magistrate forgot to breathe. The coaxial camera's algorithms panicked and tried to recognize a person without a face. "Mark," one of the observers said, voice tight. 2 hours, 27 minutes, and 12 seconds. The arm rose. The knife was a geometry again, narrow, a triangle that made itself explicit where the mirror was kindest in the ellipse. Valley held still as if motion might offend light. The strike, the dissolve. The room's truth camera recorded only a detective in a chair, doing nothing but aging. "Reverse 5 seconds, Keller said. They did. The strike replayed without difference. "Reverse 5 more. Again. No difference." The magistrate, eyes on the screen, touched her forefinger to the base of her skull without meaning to. "Mask the ellipse," Keller said, after a silence that became heavy. The tech stepped forward and pressed the vinyl oval into place. They rolled the sequence again. Without the ellipse, the reflection weakened, as if they'd put a muffler on a very specific part of memory. The figure still moved, but the blade's thin assertion lost contrast and threatened to become good manners. "Remove mask," Keller said. The blade returned to assertion. "Hold," the magistrate said, and the room obeyed because this is what rooms do when a judge speaks. "I am not saying what this is. I am saying that if we had a witness who told us a sequence twice in the same words, we would take them seriously enough to ask who taught them the story." "Noted," Valley said. They ran another hour because when the universe gives you something it has no obligation to give, you record until the obligation becomes yours. At 3:18, the screens glitched, not by dropping frames but by over-remembering. The mirror's feed held a single afterimage for 1 extra beat after the playback was scrubbed to start. Keller swore softly and wrote, "Persistence," and circled it. "Break," he said. "People fail before instruments." They cramped themselves into the kitchen for coffee that punished the tongue. The magistrate stood with her back to the sink, scarf around her wrist now like a tourniquet. "Can this be used?" she said, not yet to anyone in particular. "Not as what it appears," one observer said. "But if you asked me to testify that the room's camera showed no motion while the mirror's camera did, I would say yes with enthusiasm. Pictures of hands, not of faces." The other observer added, without realizing how much like a proverb he sounded. Valley didn't speak. He was watching the mirror in his head. He was also watching a man who might be a man assemble himself out of edges and confidence. The silhouette had length that could be measured, shoulders that drooped or didn't, a right arm that rose with commitment, a left hand that did nothing at all. "Again," he said. They returned to the rectangle of floor that had learned to be a stage. Keller reset the lamps to a very low, even level, no flicker, no excuses. An observer moved the offset mirror camera 2 centimeters to the right to slake a private superstition. The GPS pulse ticked. The coils of cable trembled a little with a draft no one could name. At 3:44, the mirror tried something new, or the room did, or truth grew bored with the shapes it had used so far. The silhouette that stepped into the ellipse didn't pace. It stood. The arm rose once. The rehearsed motion of a hand that knows a habit. The head turned a fraction more toward the glass than it had in previous replays. The ellipse, by grace or geometry, found a small strip of brightness along the wrist, the flare a cufflink makes when it catches a hostile light. "Freeze," Valley said. They froze, zoomed. The flare repeated every 8th frame, synchronized with the silhouette's minimal shift, as if a small polished thing had rotated a degree and announced itself. "Frame average," Keller told the tech, and the software complied, stacking 10 frames to make an image too stubborn to be noise. The cuff area resolved into a neat cylinder of shirt cuff and the suggestion, no more than that, of a cufflink face. Rectangular? Round? It refused that much generosity. But below the cuff, set a centimeter up the forearm, darker than the rest, a notch appeared where hair might be thinner, where an old scar might sit. "Compare," Valley said. The analyst back at the Questra answered the call like a woman given permission to pick a lock. "We pulled stills from Leone's public appearances. she said, voice crisp in the speaker. Auction floor, charity dinners. He favors a particular cufflink, rectangular, dark center, bright rim. Could be enamel with a steel border. Also, left forearm scar, 2 centimeters long, proximal to the wrist by about a thumb's width. We have 3 photographs where it's visible when he reaches for a gavel. Send me your frames. They sent them. She overlaid a transparent grid across the mirror's averaged cuff and the photograph of Leon wrapping a gavel. Not proof. The human brain is a hungry animal. It will eat resemblance and call it meat. But the alignments made a noise in Valley's head he recognized as the beginning of certainty. Hair, Keller said, surprising them. He pointed at the silhouette's head, where a recalcitrant brightness along the temple refused to sit still. There, a lighter streak. Does your man have vanity at the right temple? The analyst sent another still. Leon at an opening, head turned toward the good light. A streak of silver at the right temple, he likely described as distinguished when a barber asked how much to hide. Valley exhaled a little too fast. The room felt larger, which is what happens when a pattern begins to pick a man instead of the other way around. Caution, Keller said, and Valley nodded. The magistrate said nothing, which is what caution looks like when it has a degree. Run it live, Valley said. Don't freeze. If the mirror has another kindness to give, take it. They did. The figure held its place like a patient criminal. The arm up, the head a fraction turned. The cuff bright, then dull, then bright. The notched shadow along the forearm insisting on being read as a scar. The knife remained a geometry, not a brand. The face refused to be a face. Enough for confrontation, the magistrate said, surprising herself. Not enough for court without help, but enough to make a man talk. Valley stepped out of the rectangle and let the cameras stare at an empty chair. He took his phone, looked at the cuff again, the scar that made a centimeter into an argument, and thought of Leon aligning papers by edge as if he had been apprenticed to tidiness. Keep rolling, he told the room. If it wants to show us more, let it. I have an appointment. He pocketed the frames, not literally. Chain of custody didn't tolerate romance, but he took the certainty with him down the stairs. Outside, dawn had not yet found its way through the city's geometry. He turned toward the auction house, toward a man who had been very careful about time and had perhaps forgotten that old things keep their own clocks. Behind him, in the empty apartment, the mirror returned to being a rectangle that liked light. For a beat after the recorder stopped, it kept one extra image, cuff, scar, a right hand willing to do a simple thing thoroughly, before the surface went indifferent again. Valley arrived at the auction house before the day believed in itself. The sales floor was a dim sea of plinths and plainer hopes. Upstairs, the glass office wore yesterday's air. Espresso, paper, a fainter cologne that tried to be a signature. Leon came in smooth and on time, jacket folded over his arm the way careful men carry their shields. The streak of silver at his right temple looked cultivated, a proof of taste rather than surrender. He saw Valley, calculated quickly, and lifted a smile that had closed deals in worse rooms. Detective, he said, if there is bad news, I'd rather you say it where I can sit down. Sit, Valley said. He remained standing. Sometimes verticality is an instrument. Leon sat with a man's grace who expects to be watched. He aligned a stack of consignment forms to the desk's edge as if edges were what kept men from falling. We ran a controlled experiment last night, Valley said. 5 cameras, GPS lock time, 2 independent observers from the university, a magistrate. The mirror at Via della Pergola was uncooperative at first, then forthcoming. It produced a sequence in reflection that showed the posture of a victim and a silhouette behind her. The right arm lifted, triangular blade, a geometry, not a brand. A cuff that flashed every 8th frame. A rectangular cufflink face that caught light. A scar on the left forearm, a thumb's width above the wrist. A lighter streak at the right temple. You see where I'm going. Leon didn't look at his wrist. The good ones don't. You're telling me a mirror has opinions about my tailoring. I'm telling you your alibi has opinions about time, Valley said. He slid a page across the desk. A diagram of Wi-Fi disconnects and reconnects, the auction house camera drift, the thermal register's steady march. Your office cameras are not synchronized to an external clock. The last manual sync to a receptionist's phone introduced a drift that favors you. About 87 seconds at the relevant hour. At 14:19, your phone leaves your office Wi-Fi. The restroom camera, bless your security consultant, catches your shoulder at the door, right temple toward the light. At 14:21, your phone drops the Wi-Fi, reconnects at 14:26. You could make the walk down the service stairs, out the side door into the alley, across 30 meters of city, up one flight in Via della Pergola, do a thing you'd rehearsed in a room that helps rehearsals, and walk back. If you had a key, if the bolt weren't set. Leone's face was attentive without being eager. You're telling me I could have committed an impossible crime with a concierge's timetable and a magic mirror. I'm telling you your receptionist's phone sync makes liars of your cameras by small degrees, Valley said, and that the prepaid number that called Renata, registered to Milan without the courtesy of a name, hits our towers on 3 afternoons, all within 2 streets of her flat, and that the Milan gallery director with aura problems has a text history with you longer than his tenure. You were trying to engineer a private sale with a discount you intended to skim. Leone's mouth thought about a smile and reconsidered. You've done good homework. None of it puts me in that room. Your cufflink helps, Valley said. He pulled from a folder the frame average from the mirror's feed and the photograph of Leone wrapping a gavel at a charity sale. He set them side by side. Rectangular face, bright rim. A scar where a teenage accident or a middle-aged habit placed it. Your barber makes a profession of that silver streak at the right temple. At 2:27, the mirror shows a silhouette with those features doing an unambiguous thing. That is not evidence, Leone said, because he had been coached by life if not by counsel. That is a superstition you've taught to behave. We didn't teach it, Valley said. It knew the sequence before we plugged in. We only recorded what it does. I will not ask a judge to take the mirror's word for your guilt. I'm going to ask her to look at your arithmetic. He laid out the rest. The debt Renata carried that a fast sale would ease. The friendly loan called in by a storage facility that had run out of patience for locked crates. The thread with M negotiating a private viewing Friday, 20% under public price. The text in which M promised speed and safety and used the word jealousy as if it were collateral. Leone's eyes did one small unprofessional thing when Valley said jealousy. It was a fraction, enough. Tell me the part where you stood behind her, Valley said. He kept his tone in the quiet register that invites people to choose a smaller lie. The mirror shows hesitation. You argue. You think you are persuading. She says she'll keep the peace. Your percentage evaporates. Your patience has an edge. You raise your hand. You lower it. You raise it again as if the room has made a decision for you. Leone leaned back and regarded Valley as if estimating the bid increment on a man. Do you ever worry that you need things to be elegant? He asked. A pattern from 1894 to now. A trader's mirror. A detective who prefers stories with spine. I prefer receipts, Valley said. He slid an audit report across the desk. We pulled the metadata on your phone logs. 2 gaps. 1 minute 40 seconds of file system pause at 14:22. Another at 14:24. Your system optimized storage. It does that when a user deletes a call and the OS consolidates. Our analyst reconstructed the gap from the baseband radio logs. Your unknown caller at 14:23 is our Milan friend. He asks if the mirror is coming Friday. You tell him yes because you still believe you can make the sale after a death that looks like an accident in a locked room. A room with a mirror that shows everything but a witness. Leone's hands left the forms alone at last. They clasped, an old gesture pretending to be new. If I were the man you want, I would have used a knife that doesn't testify, he said. Ceramic, plastic, not old carbon steel that leaves poetry on gilding. You used what you own, Valley said. We all do when we're hurried or when we need a tool to feel like a principal. Your father left you a narrow blade he called a stiletto when he told stories about knights that make sons admire men who don't deserve it. You keep it in a drawer with cufflinks and pretexts. We'll get the warrant. The iron trace on the gilding sits where a man bringing a thin blade too close to admire himself would leave a ghost. The wound at the base of her skull knows a measurement. 17 centimeters. Carbon steel. Right hand. Leon's breath shortened once, then lengthened, a disciplined man taking back a room. He looked toward the glass wall as if a crowd might appear to give him a better reason to perform. You have motive you like because it makes a moral, he said. Greed, jealousy. You have clocks you've pried into agreeing with you. What you don't have is a weapon, a print, a camera that shows me in the room. And what I have, Valley said softly, is a room that shows you in the mirror. I don't need that to persuade a jury. I only need it to persuade you that I will not put this down. Men who expect to be believed sometimes confess when they realize that the person across from them does not intend to be charmed. Leon's laugh was quick and unwanted. You want me to tell you a story because your mirror is an editor who demands a human voiceover. I want you to tell me what you argued about, Valley said, because the mirror shows you arguing, and that means you wanted to be on a different side of your own act when it happened. That's the kind of detail that saves a man's life from being remembered as smaller than it was. For the first time, something in Leon's face moved without permission. It wasn't guilt, it was the thin, precise pain of being miscast. He looked down at his hands as if they were a document he needed to read carefully. She would not sell to Milan, he said, and the sentence landed as if it had needed to be somewhere. Not because of the price, because she liked that the mirror embarrassed people. She wanted it in public, with cameras, with catalog copy that said Specchio del Traditore without apology so she could watch older men laugh and then bid. She said a private buyer would hide it. I told her the world would be kinder if some things were hidden. He forced a breath, made it seem like an ethic. We were both right in ways that don't fit on invoices. What did you do? Valley asked, so quietly the room didn't flinch. After you did it? Leon looked up, and his eyes did not ask for forgiveness. They wanted credit for a kind of efficiency. I stood very still, he said, because stillness makes fewer mistakes. I looked at her and I understood that there is a difference between a sale that dies and a person who does. I set the bolt. I left. I walked the alley like a man who had left a meeting early to take a phone call. I returned to a glass office and performed the rest of my afternoon. There are confessions that trot toward theater. This one arrived like arithmetic. Neat lines, no adjectives. Valley let silence do the work of underlining. Why the mirror? He asked. You could have done it anywhere. She liked the mirror, Leon said, and for a second his voice became an honest object. And because he almost smiled, and this was worse than if he had wept, because the mirror liked me, I have stood in front of it. I know how it teaches a man to hold a knife in his head before he holds it in his hand. Valley closed the folder because that was an ending whether he liked it or not. He stood without hurrying. We're going to search your home, he said. We will find an old blade. It may be clean. It will still be yours. We will present your time adjustments and your phone's gaps and your friendly SIM. We will not present the mirror to the jury. The prosecutor will ask them to believe in a man, not a surface. Leon spread his hands a final time, palms up, priest or prisoner or salesman. Then what was all this for? He asked. The cameras, the night, the ghost with the good cuff. Valley turned toward the glass wall, where the city had gathered itself into daylight. He could see his own reflection, smaller than the room deserved. To stop lying to myself, he said, so that when you lie to the court tomorrow, you won't be the only person in the room who knows what happened. On the way out, he paused at the threshold and looked back. Leon had already reached for the forms to align their edges, the addiction of a man who needs paper to be obedient if people won't. Outside, the morning finally took. Valley walked toward the questura with the frames from the mirror held in the mind's grip where chain of custody can't reach. He thought of the magistrate's scarf and the observer's pencils and Keller writing persistence like a diagnosis. He thought of a mirror that remembered and a city that preferred not to. In his office, he wrote the report in the drier tongue prosecutors understand. Alibi tampering, phone metadata irregularities, financial motive, Known opportunity, confession, partial, request for search warrant, caution on mystical evidence. Then he set his pen down and stared at the blank part of the page where he did not write the sentence that felt truest. Asterisk, we did not catch him. The mirror made him remember he had already been caught. Asterisk. He sat back. Evidence is what a court accepts. Truth is what keeps you in the chair when the room goes dark and the surface across from you becomes deeper than glass. The arrest did not make the world neater. It only made it scheduled. Leon's counsel arrived with the briskness of someone who knew where the chairs went and where the arguments lived. He rode in on the oldest horse in the stable. Asterisk, my client is shocked. My client is grieving, asterisk, and then began to pull the room toward clocks and gaps and the risk of misunderstanding a city with too much history. The prosecutor, Rinaldi, approached the case as if laying out tools on a cloth. We will not bring a mirror to the stand, he told Valley, in an office where files leaned like tired men. We'll bring the arithmetic, the time drift, the prepaid SIM, the phone's suspicious consolidations, the financial pressure, the private sale collusion. If the defense tries to drag us into superstition, I'll cut the rope. He confessed, Valley said, not to the mirror, to the room. Half a confession, Rinaldi said. Enough for a moralist. Not enough for a judge who expects to be re-elected. They put the warrant through with the clean efficiency that comes when judges read a file and see their own caution reflected back. The search of Leon's apartment turned up the expected drawer. Cufflinks dressed for charity, a watch with a face that told more money than time, and a blade wrapped in a cloth that had learned his hands. Narrow, triangular, old steel tamed by oil. It had been cleaned with the resignation of a man who thinks diligence is redemption. The lab took it, swabbed it, found nothing human, nothing red. Caselli shrugged. Sometimes success means absence. We have iron, Valley said, on gilding, on glass. We have iron everywhere, the defense would later say, and that was true enough to sting. The pretrial hearing felt less like law than architecture. Rinaldi built his arch with stones small and regular, router logs that showed a phone sneaking off Wi-Fi, the auction house's drift, a thermal register that contradicted the office camera by precious seconds, a courier's route that put Leon under a security lens near the alley at the wrong time, the accountant's tidy columns, the Milan director's guilty SMSs hidden under stage names. He placed the partial confession like a keystone. Recorded interview, clear voice, no coercion. A man describing stillness after an irreversible act. Leon's counsel attacked everything but the keystone. He called the router logs abstruse, the drift, speculative, the courier's lens, inconclusive, the text's ambiguous commerce. He did not mention the mirror. He was too smart to taint his own voice with it. Doctor, the judge asked Caselli, is this a weapon consistent with the wound? The stiletto lay in a transparent box on a felt square, a museum of implied harm. Caselli did not perform. It could be, she said, triangular section, length within my error bars, metal consistent with traces we found. But could is a poor witness. The hearing tilted toward trial because that is what hearings do when the edges of a story hold. Rinaldi administered the oath to the small truths and promised the larger one would follow. The trial opened on a rain that made the stone of the courthouse look like a polished argument. The press did their usual inexpensive ballet. The first day drew lines around the room. Jury lean, the defense's cool contralto, Rinaldi's deliberate vowels. Valley sat where detectives sit, in a seat that tells the room he will not nod unless something deserves it. They put on the times first. An analyst diagrammed the auction house cameras as if walking children across a street. How a receptionist's sync to phone can make a clock polite to the wrong authority. How GPS pulsed recorders do not drift. How a bathroom camera, installed against the recommendation of taste, becomes useful when men believe in privacy more than prudence. The jury looked at the arrows, the stamps, the line that a man could travel in 5 minutes if he'd rehearsed it with a staircase and indifference. They did not love it. They did not hate it. It began to own real estate in their heads. Rinaldi brought in motive without poetry. The storage debt, the commission, the Milan private viewing. The text where jealousy had been written like a prediction. The accountant, crisp as a knife, explained that Renata could sell narrative and surface in the same lot, and that men like Leon built careers on being near that point of exchange with their hands out. When it came time for the interview, the court went quiet. There is a special silence in a room when the accused voice enters as a recording. The attention of people who want to be told by a machine what they should think. Leon's words sounded like a man who would have been good at reading disclaimers. I stood very still. I set the bolt. I walked back. The defense did not object. They would cross later with the elegant knife of context. They did not bring the mirror. They did bring the iron trace from gilding and the ellipse marked with tape in photographs. And the jury wrinkled at the word ellipse as if Latin were a cologne they did not choose to wear. You want the room to be guilty, the defense told the jury in opening and again in closing, modulating the timbre like a singer knows her hall. You want furniture to be an accomplice because that makes an elegant headline. The state has timestamps. Timestamps are not hands. The state has iron. Iron is democratic. The state has a voice recording of a man who could be describing shock. They do not have a blade with blood. They do not have fingerprints. They do not have a witness whose eyes were attached to a living head. Rinaldi, in return, asked the jury to live like adults in a city that had learned to tell the truth without special effects. He asked you to forgive a minute and 40 seconds because he distributed those seconds in a clever way, he said. He asked you to forgive the Wi-Fi because it is boring. He asked you to forgive a debt because it is impolite. He asked you to forgive a phone that forgot on purpose. Do not forgive the arithmetic. The verdict came the way verdicts do. First in the foreperson's eyes, then in the mouth. Guilty on the principal count. The jury took the long way around the word premeditated and stopped short of it, choosing with malice aforethought as if it came with a more comfortable chair. Leon listened as if he were a critic at a play he had already disliked. His counsel put a hand on his forearm, right where a scar made a small argument under cloth. The judge read the sentence, grave as a bell. The room emptied its adrenaline in low voices and scuffed shoes. After, in a corridor that smelled of old varnish and duty, the magistrate who had watched the ellipse breathe said to Valley, "We did not need the mirror." "We did," Valley said. "Just not here." She considered that, then made the face of a person who will not decide for another person what he is allowed to believe. The mirror went to storage, Uffizi's secure underbelly, where problematic beauty is kept cool. The crate looked ordinary until you knew what it contained. Keller supervised the packing as if placing a friend in a monastery. "No polishing," he told the handlers, a joke that wasn't. The storage manager signed a form in triplicate and performed the tiny sacrament of locking a door. 2 weeks later, the guard in that corridor, a man who liked crosswords and solitude, called Valley at an hour that implied apology. "It isn't my habit to ring police," he said, breathy, embarrassed. "But there's a thing you've fostered." Valley signed in with the uneconomic slowness security demands and walked the cold hall. The guard stood by a viewing panel with his dignity in both hands. "It shows things," he said. "Not the crime. Other things." I stood for a minute longer than I should, and I saw a man behind me doing what I have not done. "Which man?" Valley asked, careful. "Me?" the guard said, with a shame that made him angry. "Young. Not kind. I didn't do it. I wanted to. Years ago. It knows that I wanted to." They stood in front of the crate with its slatted window. The mirror glowed faintly with the ambient light of institutional LEDs that pretend they are not depressing. In its surface, the corridor extended farther than the corridor allowed. For a half-breath, Valley thought he saw his own silhouette with a gun held close to the body, no brand, just geometry. He did not move. He lifted his eyes until the image retreated, which could be a trick of optics, or of a man refusing to think about the future he had dodged. "Lock it," he told the guard, "and post a note, no loitering." He heard himself and almost laughed. He called the magistrate. "We need a place that is not a museum," he said, "and not a police evidence room. A place where things that make stories out of men are allowed to be forgotten." "There's a crypt space beneath the old print store," she said slowly. "Stone. Dry. Boring. The best kind of vault. The paperwork will be a tangle. Paperwork is our penance, Valley said. They moved the mirror at dawn, with fewer men than dignity suggested, precisely because too many eyes taught stories to spread. The crate went down stone steps that had been carved when Florence learned to hide things it did not want to destroy. The air smelled of dust that had never been angry. A single bulb over a caged socket offered enough light to say present without being proud. They set the crate down. Keller watched the glass not like a scientist now, but like a man who had been trusted with someone else's secret. He exhaled and nodded at Valley, a benediction or a receipt. "Seal it," Valley said. He stood while the signatures multiplied. Wax over thread like a costume they refused to mock. Photographs of seals that would be checked against seals later by men who loved seals. It was the sort of ceremony civilizations invent to remind themselves they can still control objects by naming them and locking them. When they were done, the crypt felt more honest than the rooms above it. The magistrate put her scarf back on, as if she had been cold without admitting it. Keller touched the frame one last time with a gloved knuckle, the way a man greets a horse. On the stairs up, the magistrate said, "You look older." "I am," Valley said. At street level, morning made a mild effort. He walked alone toward the river. He tried, for the sport of it, to imagine a city without reflective surfaces. He failed. In a storefront window, he saw himself pass and did not slow down. In the water, he saw the sky pretending to be a river and let it. Back at his desk, he wrote the final memorandum for the file. Mirror removed to secure storage. No further investigative action planned. Cautionary note regarding personnel loitering. He put his pen down and waited for the moment when the case deserts you. Didn't. Some cases never learned to leave. At the end of the day, he took the long way home. He paused once at a shuttered shop where the glass had been used for notes. Chalk on outside, breath on inside. In the reflection, he saw a man with a gun, or perhaps a man with a notebook. He chose the notebook and walked on. The crypt beneath the old print store breathed like a careful animal. Stone kept its vows. Dust performed its small liturgy in the corners. Valley signed the last page in a stack of papers that pretended to be a spell and waited for the echo of the door to swallow itself. When the others had gone, he stayed. He told himself he was confirming the seal. He knew he was saying goodbye to an object he had not learned to like and could not afford to love. The crate's inspection window offered a palm's width of the mirror, enough to prove survival, not enough to invite conversation. He flicked the bulb off, then on again, a childish superstition his hand performed before the rest of him could vote. The silver accepted the stammered light with the indifference of old saints. "You aren't evidence," he said to the glass. "You only remember." The word hung there, not contested, not embraced. In the rectangle, the corridor behind him doubled, its shallow depth pretending to be oceanic. He saw his own outline embedded in quarrystone quiet. He did not look for anyone else. He had learned, finally, that looking was how you offered a surface permission to report you. He turned and climbed, the stairs slow, the air shifting from crypt dry to city warmed. Above ground, Florence stretched awake. Delivery scooters wrote their scripture in exhaust on the margins of streets. A woman tugged at a shutter. A child kicked a bottle cap down a gutter and made a tune from tin. The river wore mourning like a habit it had not chosen. He stopped at the bridge and let the wind subtract the night from his coat. The case had a verdict and a place to sleep. It had witnesses who would never testify and a mirror that had given him the only gift it had, an image that refused to ask for belief. It should have been enough. He watched a tourist take a photograph of a couple leaning over stone, then reverse the phone to the front camera to prove to themselves they had been there. He felt old in the way a lens makes you, not by taking years, but by measuring you against the hurry of those who don't yet count them. He walked to the archive vault where boxes stacked their patient geometry. The clerk, who liked him, pushed the sign in toward him without irony. He requested the photographs from 1957 again, the plates that had become blur and therefore confession. He requested the 1894 pencil diagram, the one that loved the frame more than the bed. He laid them side by side on a cloth as if they were cousins who had never met. He set his notebook next to them and wrote, "For no audience and every future version of himself." Asterisk objects do not lie. People do and then teach objects to carry the lie. But some objects learn resentment. They show what they are given, then keep showing it after the room has decided to forget. Asterisk. He closed the book and returned the past to the men who charged a modest fee for its storage. Outside, the city looked blameless because it had learned to be beautiful while men did things inside it that didn't deserve windows. He took the long way back to the office, past Via della Pergola. Lucia was in the courtyard with her lemon tree, pinching a leaf to release a scent that remembered summers better than anyone else there. She saw him, lifted a hand with the embarrassed authority of a landlady whose building had been in the paper, and said, "Is it over?" "It's put away," he said. "That's the closest we get." She nodded the way you nod at weather you cannot change. "The room feels like itself again," she said. "I dusted without feeling watched." "Keep dusting," he said. "It persuades things to be furniture." He went up once more and stood where Renata had stood, hands over the console's edge, head slightly bowed as if reading could make the day say yes. The police cylinder had been replaced by a locksmith who believed in new beginnings. The mirror had left a rectangle of cleaner paint where it had devoted itself to a wall, a paler silhouette of absence, accurate to the millimeter. Light pooled there and spilled in an obedient square onto the floorboards. The room was smaller without the silver, but more honest. He closed his eyes, opened them, confirmed that his body could stand in a space without seeing itself, and left. His office wore the usual fatigue of paper and decisions. He filed the last memo in a drawer that did not deserve its importance, then sat with a cup of coffee that had stopped pretending to be good. The city made a sound through the window, friendly, forgiving, relatively true. He wrote a letter to himself for a year from now and sealed it because sometimes you mark a date on a map that only you will visit. He did not return to the crypt for a month. Work bent him toward other puzzles that did not involve glass. Then, on a Tuesday that had been ordinary past the point of rudeness, he found his feet taking him down those steps. The guard nodded once and did not ask. Valley unlocked the outer door, then the inner, then touched the seals with a care that was almost mocking of the word tamper-proof. The crate accepted him like a church that will listen even if it will not absolve. He leaned to the inspection window. The corridor beyond him arranged itself into perspective. The bulb hummed its low insect prayer. The silver did not brighten. He held his breath and told his body he was not waiting. In the glass, after several seconds that produced no physics, a figure assembled. It was not clever. It was simply stubborn. The man in the rectangle wore his coat. Today's coat, the ordinary one he never remembered buying. The man's shoulders sloped in a way that comes from standing too long at tables where dead people are discussed. The man lifted his right hand and for a single unkind instant, Valley saw the geometry of a gun. He did not carry a gun that day. He had checked his desk, his drawer, his old habits. He stood very still. The figure in the glass made the motion again, slow enough to drain the theatricality from it. An empty hand rehearsing weight. He closed his eyes and tasted metal in a mouth that had no reason to taste it. When he opened them, the figure was not holding anything, had never held anything. It stood and matched his breath exactly. He allowed himself a proper breath only when he noticed that his own reflection had done it first. "Evidence is what a court accepts," he said, because the mirror had taught him to speak aloud to silence. "Truth is what keeps me awake." He reached to pull the bulb chain and paused. In the rectangle, behind his shoulder, the corridor's door eased toward its frame. He turned, slow, ritual, so as not to make a trick for himself. The actual door stood open, unmoved. In the glass, the door closed. No hand on the handle, no arm. Just the sound a door doesn't make in a picture. He let the chain fall and left the bulb on, because denying a mirror light is only another kind of courtesy. He sealed the crate again and wrote his initials in the margin of a form already bloated with them. On the steps, he stopped and looked at the stone as if it could answer. He thought of the landlady's men in 1991 arguing with screws, of a restorer in 1957 etching his boredom into wood, of a boarding house clerk in 1894 writing Specchio del Traditore. in the margin because the main text had been too shy. He thought of Leah and her camera, of Keller's pencil patience, of a magistrate's scarf winding around a wrist like a reminder to be careful with blood that isn't there. He walked back into morning. On a shop front, a window wore the hand-painted word Chuso and tried to look elegant while admitting defeat. In its reflection he saw a man pause, then continue. He did not check whether the man had a gun. He had decided to prefer the version of himself that carried a notebook and the habit of asking. Florence resumed its glow with the insolence of cities that outlive their citizens. In 100 apartments, mirrors watched rooms forget arguments and remember faces. On Via della Pergola, a replacement rectangle of bland glass arrived one day and did its job without rumors. Somewhere beneath galleries full of saints and sinners, a crate waited with its small window, recording nothing or everything, or the exact amount of both needed to make a life. Valley crossed the piazza and didn't look at the cafe window. He didn't need to. He felt the surface on his skin the way you feel weather. He touched his jaw where a poppy seed mole had become a metronome, then lowered his hand in case the day was honest enough to notice. He had a desk to return to and a pen that kept refusing to be dramatic. He walked, and in the glass of the bookshop he did not enter. He watched a door close after him, with no one visible holding the handle. And so concludes Reflections of a Guilty Man, a story where Florence's beauty carried its own shadows, and where a mirror remembered what no witness dared to admit. In this case, justice leaned on time, motives, and arithmetic. But somewhere beneath the surface, silver still held the truth, refusing to forget. Thank you for joining us tonight on Somnolent Conspiracies. Your time, your attention, and your imagination are what keep these stories alive. If this tale unsettled you, if it made you glance twice at the glass on your wall, then the story has done its work. We'd be grateful if you would subscribe, ring the notification bell, and leave a like, so you'll never miss the next journey into the places where mystery and fear intertwine. Until then, remember, every reflection waits for a crack, and sometimes the shadows look back. Good night, and thank you for listening.